Welcome back to Background Historian. Thank you for being patient, as we are now back on our usual schedule of one episode every night. Tonight, we take a look at a controversial, historic, and to some, a holy endeavor. The Christian Crusades were a series of medieval wars that aimed at pushing Muslim conquest out of the Holy Land, and Europe itself. Prepare yourself to be immersed in the holy history of Catholicism in medieval Europe. Let's begin. Part 1, The Holy Lands before the Crusades. Before the banners of the cross and crescent clashed, before the marching of armored knights and the echo of prayer on battlefields, there was a land ancient beyond measure. The stretch of earth we now call the Holy Land had already lived 1,000 lives by the time the Crusades were conceived. It had been the meeting point of civilizations: Canaanite, Egyptian, Israelite, Persian, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, and Arab. Every empire that rose upon its horizon left behind its footprints in stone, in scripture, in blood, and in memory. By the late 11th century, the region around Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Antioch had seen centuries of exchange, pilgrimage, and quiet coexistence as well as tension. The city of Jerusalem itself, built on rocky hills between the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean, shimmered beneath the sun like a promise. To Jews, it remained the city of David and the Temple of Solomon. To Christians, it was the place where Christ had walked, taught, died, and, according to their faith, risen. To Muslims, it was Al-Quds, the noble sanctuary, the site of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey to heaven. Three faiths, one small patch of earth, all looking upward toward the same sky. Under the early caliphates, Jerusalem had been a city of pilgrimage rather than conflict. The Muslim conquerors of the 7th century allowed Christian and Jewish communities to remain. Churches stood beside mosques, languages mingled in the markets. Pilgrims from distant Christian lands were permitted to visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre by paying modest taxes. For centuries, caravans of travelers crossed the eastern Mediterranean, praying as they went, leaving offerings at shrines that dotted the landscape from Constantinople to Bethlehem. But even in peace, history was stirring. By the time Europe's knights began to look eastward, the map of the Middle East had changed many times. The Byzantine Empire still held Constantinople, though its borders had receded. The Abbasid Caliphate ruled nominally from Baghdad, yet real power had fractured among local dynasties. The Fatimids, an Ismaili Shirai dynasty based in Egypt, controlled Jerusalem in the later 10th century. Then, sweeping in from Central Asia, came the Seljuk Turks, new converts to Islam, fierce horsemen who reshaped the politics of the Islamic world. When the Seljuks defeated the Byzantines at Manzikert in 1071, the tremor was felt across Christendom. For the first time, the Eastern Empire's defenses cracked open, and news of its suffering reached Western Europe. Pilgrims traveling through Anatolia spoke of harassment and danger. Tales grew with every retelling: churches desecrated, roads unsafe, holy sites threatened. Some reports were exaggerated, others were rooted in genuine instability. But perception, in the 11th century as in every age, could move mountains. Europe itself was undergoing transformation. The year 1000 had come and gone, and with it, a sense of spiritual anxiety and awakening. Kingdoms were solidifying: France under the Capetians, England under the Normans, the German realms under the Holy Roman Emperor. The Church in Rome, led by reforming popes such as Gregory VII, sought to assert moral and political authority over these rising powers. Monastic life flourished, pilgrimage became an act of devotion practiced by rich and poor alike. To journey east was not merely to travel, it was to purify the soul. Yet the path to Jerusalem had grown perilous. The Seljuk advance fractured old arrangements that had protected pilgrims. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, watching his empire shrink, sent envoys westward seeking military aid. It was a request for mercenaries, but what he received would become something entirely different. At this moment of tension and yearning, Pope Urban II rose to prominence. The papacy had recently asserted its independence from secular rulers through the reforms of the investiture controversy. Urban saw an opportunity not only to assist fellow Christians in the East but to unite the quarrelsome knights of Europe under a single sacred cause. To him, the Holy Land was not a distant territory, it was the heart of the Christian imagination. But before his call echoed across Europe, the land itself lay quiet, holding its breath. In Jerusalem, muezzins called the faithful to prayer from the Haram al-Sharif. Monks tended the Church of the Nativity. Jewish scholars studied scripture in narrow courtyards shaded by vines. The markets buzzed with traders selling silk and spices from Persia, oil from Galilee, and incense from Yemen. Life, as it always had, continued between prayers and politics. The idea that this land could become the center of a global war of faith would have seemed impossible to many who lived there. And yet, beneath the rhythms of daily life, fault lines were forming, economic, political, and spiritual. The pilgrims arriving from Europe felt awe but also alienation. The languages, the minarets, the sound of Arabic recitations, all reminded them that they were strangers in a world that had once been Roman and Christian. In taverns and monasteries across Europe, that sense of loss took on a holy urgency. Meanwhile, within the Islamic world, the call for unity was rising. Scholars wrote of restoring justice and defending the faith. Rulers vied for legitimacy by promising to protect the sacred places. The Seljuk sultans and the Abbasid caliphs both saw themselves as defenders of Islam, even as their rivalries weakened the realm. When word would later reach them that an army of Franks was marching east under the sign of the cross, they would be divided, unprepared, and uncertain whether this was a raid, a pilgrimage, or an invasion. The centuries before the Crusades were not a void but a living tapestry of coexistence and competition. Jews, Christians, and Muslims shared the same wells, traded in the same markets, and sometimes prayed within sight of one another's shrines. The tension lay not only between faiths but within them, between ambition and devotion, between peace and pride. In the monasteries of Europe, chroniclers described Jerusalem in glowing, impossible terms, a city paved with gold, the very center of the earth, a place where heaven touched the ground. To reclaim it, they believed, would bring the world closer to salvation. To lose it, as rumor claimed it had been lost, was to let darkness reign. By 1095, when Pope Urban II would finally raise his voice at Clermont, the world was ready to listen. The hearts of knights, peasants, and priests alike were restless. The age was ripe for a holy journey, one that promised both redemption and glory. But before that first crusading banner rose, the Holy Land remained what it had always been, a crossroads of belief, beauty, and longing. It was not yet divided by the swords of Europe, though the winds of history had begun to shift. The fires that would soon engulf continents were, for now, only sparks glimmering in the twilight. The story of the Crusades begins not with battle but with yearning, with a continent looking eastward and a land waiting, unknowingly, for the arrival of strangers who believed they were fulfilling God's will. And in the stillness before that storm, the Holy Land slept under its starlit sky, ancient and eternal, holding the weight of every prayer whispered upon its soil. Part 2, A Call from Rome, Pope Urban II and the Birth of a Holy War. The year was 1095, and the winds of change were stirring across Europe. The continent had begun to awaken from centuries of fragmentation following the collapse of the Carolingian Empire. Castles rose on hillsides, trade routes reopened, and cathedrals began to climb toward the heavens. Yet beneath this renewal ran deep veins of restlessness and rivalry. Knights trained for war but lacked causes worthy of their skill. Lords quarreled with neighbors, kings wrestled with the church for power. Amid this turbulence, a single voice would call Europe to a purpose so vast that it would alter the course of the world. That voice belonged to Pope Urban II. He was a Frenchman by birth, educated in the discipline of the reforming papacy that sought to free the church from the grip of kings and nobles. His reign began in 1088, a time of turbulence even within Christendom itself. The investiture controversy still raged: who had the right to appoint bishops, kings, or popes? Urban had watched his predecessor, Gregory VII, defy Emperor Henry IV and pay dearly for it. Urban understood that spiritual authority was not merely to be defended, it had to be demonstrated. Beyond Rome's disputes, the Byzantine Empire was faltering. For centuries it had stood as the eastern guardian of Christendom, its wealth and learning unrivaled in Europe. But in 1071, the empire had suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Seljuk Turks at the Battle of Manzikert. The loss opened Anatolia to Turkish conquest, severing Byzantium's richest provinces and exposing the empire's very heartland. The Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, pragmatic and shrewd, saw that he could not hold back the tide alone. So, in desperation and strategy alike, he reached west. He sent envoys to the Pope, ambassadors clad in imperial purple, bearing letters that spoke of lost lands, desecrated churches, and the suffering of Eastern Christians. To the Byzantine mind, this was a request for aid, perhaps for mercenaries. But when these pleas reached Urban II, they became something more. Urban saw in Alexios's request an opportunity of divine proportion, to heal the thousand-year rift between the Latin West and Greek East, to assert Rome's leadership over all Christendom, and to direct Europe's restless warriors toward a sacred cause. By helping the East, he could strengthen the papacy's moral authority and transform feuding knights into soldiers of faith. That autumn, Urban traveled north through France, moving from town to town, rallying clergy and laity alike. His journey ended in November at the Council of Clermont, a gathering of bishops, abbots, and nobles. It was here that history turned. Eyewitnesses recorded fragments of the speech he gave that day, though each chronicler remembered it differently. No written transcript survives, only echoes shaped by time and passion. Yet through them all runs a shared current. Urban spoke of a call to holiness and heroism, of a journey east not for conquest, but for salvation. He painted a vivid picture of suffering, Christians in the East oppressed, holy places defiled, pilgrims harassed. Whether those details were exaggerated or not, his audience believed every word. And then he offered a vision. Whoever for devotion alone, not for honor or gain, shall set out to liberate the Holy Sepulchre, he proclaimed, that journey shall be accounted in place of all penance. The promise electrified the crowd. Here was redemption not through cloistered prayer, but through action. Here was forgiveness of sins through bravery. For knights trained in violence but bound by guilt, this was revelation. Their swords, long symbols of sin, could now become instruments of faith. Chroniclers tell of a roar rising from the assembly, Deus vult. God wills it. The cry rolled through the fields of Clermont like thunder, spontaneous and unified, as though Europe's long-dormant soul had suddenly remembered its purpose. Urban's genius lay not only in the call itself, but in its framing. The crusade, as he envisioned it, was more than war, it was pilgrimage, penance, and unity. Participants would wear the sign of the cross on their clothing, marking their vow to God. It would be both a spiritual journey and a military expedition. Yet even in this moment of exaltation, the seeds of misunderstanding were already sown. Urban's vision was spiritual, disciplined, and obedient to Rome. But as the message spread across Europe, it took on a life of its own. Preachers carried it to villages and marketplaces, reshaping it with each retelling. In some versions, the Turks were portrayed as monstrous invaders, in others, Jerusalem was described as a city crying out for rescue. The language of salvation mingled with rumor and rage. For common people, the call to crusade offered escape from poverty and sin alike. For lords, it promised land, adventure, and divine favor. For merchants, it opened visions of trade and treasure. What had begun as a papal appeal for aid began to swell into a mass movement unlike anything the medieval world had ever seen. Urban, meanwhile, continued to organize. He appointed legates to oversee the effort and instructed bishops to rally recruits. The church's network, its pulpits, monasteries, and shrines, became the first communication system of the crusade. The cross, once a symbol of suffering, became the emblem of a new holy order. In the East, Emperor Alexios received word that armies were gathering, but the reports were bewildering. Thousands of commoners, men, women, and even children, were setting out ahead of any formal campaign, led by wandering preachers and minor knights. This was not what he had envisioned when he requested aid. These were not disciplined soldiers, but pilgrims driven by faith, desperation, and rumor. Still, Urban's vision had taken hold. Across France and Germany, blacksmiths hammered out armor, tailors stitched red crosses onto cloaks, and monasteries filled with prayers for those who would soon depart. Preachers described Jerusalem in rapturous terms, the city where Christ had walked, the navel of the world, the gate to heaven itself. To reclaim it was not merely to win land, it was to fulfill prophecy. For many who took the cross, it was not about politics at all. It was about proximity to the divine. To walk the same roads as Christ, to pray at his tomb, to fight where he had suffered, these were acts of devotion as pure as they were perilous. Few would have understood the complexities of Byzantine diplomacy or Islamic politics. They went east seeking salvation, not strategy. Urban himself would never see the fruits of his call. He died in 1099, just 2 weeks after Crusader forces captured Jerusalem, never knowing how the city had been taken, nor the blood that had been spilled in his name. But the world he left behind was forever changed. His sermon at Clermont had unleashed something larger than faith alone, the power of collective imagination. For the first time, Europe moved not as scattered kingdoms but as a single body animated by belief. The First Crusade would soon follow, and with it, the mingling of holiness and horror that would define the next 2 centuries. In that moment, though, the world still stood on the threshold. The Pope's words had been spoken, the vows made, the banners prepared. The people of Europe, peasants, priests, and princes alike, looked eastward, toward a land they barely understood, but felt called to save. The Holy War had begun not with a clash of swords, but with a sermon in a field, a voice echoing across the hills of France, promising heaven to those who would walk into hell. Part 3, The March East, the First Crusade. The winter after Pope Urban's call was a season of preparation and wonder. Across Europe, the news of a holy expedition spread faster than parchment could carry it. Monks repeated it in their sermons, minstrels sang it in market squares, and even illiterate farmers spoke of Jerusalem as though it were just over the next hill. In castles and cottages alike, people began to sell what they had and bind up what remained. The road east awaited. No one truly knew what the journey would entail. Maps were vague, distances uncertain. Some imagined it would take a few weeks, others thought it would be like a pilgrimage to Rome, long but bearable. Yet the distances were far greater, and the path far more treacherous than any could have conceived. The first to answer the call were not kings or nobles, but common people. They came from villages across France, Germany, and Italy, peasants, craftsmen, even entire families, led by wandering preachers who spoke with fiery conviction. The most famous among them was Peter the Hermit, a small, austere man who rode a donkey through the countryside, his voice rising above crowds with a strange power. He spoke not of conquest, but of salvation. To him, the crusade was a path to purify the soul through suffering and faith. His words burned through Europe like wildfire. Thousands followed Peter, forming what would later be called the People's Crusade. They left their fields, their homes, and sometimes their reason behind. With makeshift banners and meager supplies, they marched toward Constantinople, the great capital of Byzantium, believing the hand of God would guide them. Along the way, their numbers swelled and their discipline faltered. The long road through the Rhineland and the Balkans tested both faith and flesh. Food ran short, tempers grew, and rumors of miracles mixed with stories of violence. By the time Peter and his followers reached the walls of Constantinople, they were a haggard, hungry multitude. The Emperor Alexios Komnenos, who had asked the West for help, watched this tide of ragged pilgrims with alarm. He had expected trained soldiers, not peasants. Yet he received them as best he could, offering food, ferries, and firm instructions to wait across the Bosporus for the knights who would follow. Many did not wait. They crossed early into Anatolia and met disaster, unprepared for the harshness of the land and the skill of the Turkish riders who ruled it. Behind them, however, came the true crusading armies, the great hosts of Europe's nobility. They were led by princes and lords of renown, Godfrey of Bouillon and his brother Baldwin from Lorraine, Raymond of St. Gilles, the old and pious Count of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman adventurer with ambition as fierce as his sword, and others from every corner of the continent. Each brought their own men, banners, and motives, some pure, some less so. When these armored hosts arrived before Constantinople, Alexios faced a dilemma. The armies he had summoned were far larger than he'd imagined, and their commanders were no simple mercenaries, they were rulers in their own right, proud and suspicious. The emperor feared they might turn against him as easily as they might fight the Turks. To secure their loyalty, he demanded oaths, they would return any conquered lands that had once belonged to Byzantium. Some swore reluctantly, others evaded the promise. In early spring, the Crusaders crossed the Bosporus into Asia Minor. For most of them, it was their first step onto non-Christian soil. The landscape was foreign and forbidding, rolling plains under a pitiless sun, scattered with ruins and the bones of forgotten empires. The air shimmered with heat by day and chilled to ice by night. Their first test came at Nicaea, a city held by the Seljuk Turks. Once a proud Byzantine stronghold, it now stood as a symbol of all they hoped to reclaim. The siege began in earnest, and for the first time, the Crusaders encountered the disciplined warfare of their enemies, archers on swift horses, towers manned with fire, and defenders skilled in the art of endurance. The siege dragged on for weeks, punctuated by prayer and skirmish, until Alexios's envoys secretly negotiated the city's surrender. When Nicaea fell, the Crusaders expected plunder, but the emperor took possession, denying them the spoils. It was an early wound to the alliance that bound east and west. From there, the march pressed deeper into Anatolia. It was a march through hunger and dust, across plains that seemed endless. The heat was merciless, and water scarce. Horses collapsed, wagons broke, and men stumbled onward, driven by faith and the hope of divine reward. the Turkish forces shadowed them, never engaging directly but striking with arrows and speed. At Dorylaeum, the Crusaders found themselves ambushed in open country. For hours, chaos reigned, banners fell, and the line nearly broke. But through desperation and courage, they rallied. When reinforcements under Bohemond arrived, the Turks withdrew. It was the first true victory of the crusade, and it became legend almost overnight. The path beyond Dorylaeum was no easier. The land burned beneath their feet. Every mile brought exhaustion and death, yet also a kind of fervent unity. Chroniclers described the army as a living church, its ranks moving to hymns instead of drums, its discipline forged in suffering. Priests carried relics before the soldiers, banners bearing the cross waved above weary heads. By late 1097, they reached the fertile lands of Syria and northern Mesopotamia. There, for the first time, they began to glimpse cities that seemed almost otherworldly. Antioch, with its vast walls and minarets gleaming under the sun, markets filled with silk and spices, the air rich with the scent of fruit and incense. To Europeans hardened by years of scarcity, the East seemed a place of both wonder and temptation. The siege of Antioch would become one of the most grueling events of the entire crusade, lasting many months and testing every ideal that had carried them from home. The city was vast and heavily fortified, its defenders resilient and determined. The Crusaders built walls around the walls, cutting off supplies even as they starved themselves. Hunger reduced nobles and peasants alike to desperation. Horses were eaten, belts and leather boiled for food. Yet still, they stayed. Faith sustained them when reason could not. Visions and relics became their lifelines. Chroniclers spoke of miracles, of light seen over the battlefield, of holy relics discovered beneath churches, of voices in the night urging them onward. Whether real or imagined, these stories gave meaning to suffering. When Antioch finally fell, the victory was hollow. The Crusaders, exhausted and divided, found themselves besieged in turn by a massive relief army. For a time, it seemed that the entire enterprise would end there in ruin. Yet through endurance, desperation, and perhaps sheer chance, they held. After Antioch, the survivors looked to Jerusalem, still far to the south, but at last within reach. What began as a sermon in a field in France had become a pilgrimage of both faith and fire. Thousands who had set out were gone, but those who remained believed more fiercely than ever that they had been chosen. They no longer marched as knights or peasants, as Frenchmen or Germans, but as something new, pilgrims of war, bound by oath and suffering. Their world had expanded beyond imagination, and the land they sought shimmered ahead like a promise half remembered in a dream. They were weary, diminished, and changed forever. Yet as they pressed onward through the heat and dust, they could not know that their journey would soon culminate in one of the most astonishing and devastating events in medieval history. For now, they marched east, toward a city whose name had become synonymous with heaven itself. And as they moved, the dust of their passage rose into the air and drifted westward, carrying with it the first whispers of a new age, a world in which faith and conquest would walk hand in hand, and history itself would be rewritten by those who dared to believe the impossible. Part 4. Jerusalem taken, triumph and tragedy. By the summer of 1099, the survivors of the long march east stood upon the ridges that overlooked a city unlike any they had ever seen. After years of travel and loss, Jerusalem appeared before them not as a city of gold, but as a mirage rising from stone and dust. The sunlight shimmered over its domes and towers, and in that light the exhausted pilgrims saw not geography but destiny. They had walked nearly 3,000 miles, endured hunger and hardship beyond words, and now the very city that had filled Europe's imagination for centuries lay before them, close enough to see, yet still guarded by walls that seemed as ancient as time itself. Their numbers were small, perhaps no more than a fraction of those who had set out from Europe. Yet their faith had hardened into something unbreakable. Chroniclers would later write that they marched barefoot the final miles, chanting psalms beneath the merciless sky. To them, this was not simply conquest, it was culmination. They were not an army, but a congregation that had been forged by suffering. Jerusalem at that time was held by the Fatimid Caliphate, recently recaptured from the Seljuk Turks. Its garrison, commanded by Iftikhar al-Dawla, prepared for siege. The defenders were well provisioned, the Crusaders were not. The surrounding land was barren, stripped of crops and trees by years of war. Water was scarce, the heat unbearable. Yet the pilgrims built siege towers and engines from whatever wood they could find, dismantling ships and even their own wagons. When they prayed, they faced the walls. When they slept, they dreamed of deliverance. Weeks turned into months. The siege became a test not only of endurance, but of belief. Food dwindled, sickness spread, and the air shimmered with the dry haze of summer. Chroniclers describe scenes of deep devotion, processions around the city's walls, priests lifting relics toward the sky, voices chanting through the night. Whether one views these as acts of faith or desperation, they gave structure to the chaos. Inside Jerusalem, the people waited, listening to the distant rhythm of the Crusaders' hymns. The defenders were determined and resourceful, their walls tall and thick. Yet the tide of history, slow and relentless, was moving toward its fateful hour. When the city finally fell in mid-July, word of the event spread faster than any messenger could ride. Europe rejoiced as church bells rang in every town. To the chroniclers of the West, it was a miracle, the fulfillment of prophecy, the triumph of God's will on earth. For the Muslim world, it was a deep wound, a loss of one of Islam's holiest cities, and a shock that would take decades to fully absorb. Pope Urban II, whose call at Clermont had begun it all, never heard the news. He died 2 weeks before word reached Rome, unaware that his dream had been realized. The Crusaders who survived gathered in the city's churches, weeping and praying, unsure whether to feel joy or exhaustion. For them, the long road of suffering had led to salvation. For those who looked on from afar, the event marked the dawn of a new and uncertain age. In the aftermath, a new kingdom was proclaimed, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, ruled by Godfrey of Bouillon, who refused to be called king, saying he would not wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. From a religious vision, the crusade had become a political reality, and with it came the immense challenge of ruling a land where 3 faiths had lived side by side for centuries. The Crusaders built churches and fortresses, monks and knights settled among the local peoples. Yet beneath the outward calm, tension simmered. Trade resumed between coastal cities, pilgrims continued to arrive, and the rhythms of daily life began to return, but the memory of conquest lingered like dust in the air. For the Muslim world, the fall of Jerusalem was more than a military defeat, it was a spiritual crisis. Chroniclers from Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad recorded the news with disbelief and sorrow. How could a city so sacred, defended by the faithful, have fallen? Preachers called for repentance, scholars for unity. Out of this grief would eventually arise new leaders, new strategies, and a new idea, that of the jihad as a defensive struggle to restore what had been lost. But that moment was still in the future. In 1099, the world simply reeled from the shock. The First Crusade had succeeded beyond all expectation, yet its victory carried a weight that none could yet comprehend. For every pilgrim who rejoiced, others saw in the event a fracture that would take centuries to heal. The East and West had met, but not in understanding. They had met in fervor, each convinced that it served divine purpose. And so, beneath the hot winds of that summer, the walls of Jerusalem once more echoed with prayer. In its streets walked men who believed they had touched heaven, and others who felt that heaven had turned its face away. The Holy Land, long a meeting place of peoples and faiths, would never again be the same. The world had entered a new chapter, one in which faith would move armies, and belief would redraw the map of civilizations. For now, however, as dusk fell over the city, the fires dimmed and the bells grew quiet. The pilgrims who had once dreamed of Jerusalem now found themselves within it, gazing at the same stars that had guided them from the fields of France. And perhaps, in that moment of stillness, even the victors felt the weight of what had been done, and what would follow. They had taken the city, but in doing so, they had also taken upon themselves the burden of its destiny. And in the silence that followed, history itself seemed to hold its breath. Part 5, The Kingdoms of the Cross, Life in the Latin East. In the years that followed the capture of Jerusalem, the pilgrims who had once marched beneath the blazing sun found themselves transformed into settlers. They had come seeking salvation and found a kingdom. What began as a crusade now became an experiment in endurance, faith, and coexistence, a fragile world built upon hope and stone. The Crusader states emerged almost organically, like new vines twining around old ruins. At their center stood Jerusalem, the city that gave the endeavor its name and purpose. Around it stretched the Kingdom of Jerusalem, bordered by the county of Tripoli to the north, the Principality of Antioch beyond that, and the distant county of Edessa along the Euphrates. Each had its own ruler, its own character, and its own dreams. Jerusalem was the spiritual heart, ruled first by Godfrey of Bouillon, who took the humble title, Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. When he died, His brother Baldwin succeeded him as king, and the court began to resemble those of Europe, complete with knights, laws, and ceremonies. Yet this was no ordinary European realm. The air was different here, the light sharper, the soil older. To the Franks, as the locals called them, every street seemed to whisper of scripture. They lived in a place where faith and geography were one. The settlers built churches, fortresses, and towns along the coast. They restored roads, reopened markets, and revived the flow of pilgrims from the west. Italian merchant cities, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, established trading posts in the ports of Acre, Jaffa, and Tyre, bringing with them goods from across the Mediterranean. Silks from Damascus, spices from Arabia, sugar from the fields of the Levant, all found their way into European hands. Life in the Latin East was a tapestry of contrasts. The newcomers brought their customs, but they could not ignore the influence of the land they now called home. Frankish lords wore linen instead of wool, drank sherbet and rosewater, and learned to build houses with shaded courtyards to keep out the heat. Their kitchens filled with dates, figs, and almonds, their ears grew accustomed to the call to prayer that echoed across valleys and cities. Over time, some learned Arabic or Greek, and many employed local scribes and artisans. The population was as diverse as the desert itself. Alongside the Crusaders and their descendants lived native Christians, Armenians, Syriacs, and Greeks, who had been there for centuries. There were Muslims who remained under new rule, paying taxes in exchange for peace, and Jewish communities who continued their traditions quietly amid the changes. Trade brought Persians, Egyptians, and even pilgrims from the distant steppes. The Crusader states were, in truth, a mosaic, uneasy, fragile, but vibrant. Religion permeated every corner of life. The Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem became the beating heart of the new kingdom, drawing pilgrims from all of Europe. Monastic orders flourished, the Hospitallers tending the sick and poor, the Templars guarding roads and shrines. These warrior monks became legends of discipline and piety, embodying the paradox of the age, men of prayer who carried swords. Yet even amid prosperity, the Crusader states lived under a shadow. The Muslim world, though fragmented in those early years, had not forgotten. The great cities of Damascus, Aleppo, and Cairo watched with suspicion and sorrow. Armies gathered, envoys rode, alliances shifted. For the moment, however, the Latin lords enjoyed a tenuous peace. Treaties were signed, truces honored, and trade flowed even between supposed enemies. Daily life in the Latin East had a rhythm that was both familiar and foreign. Farmers tended olive groves and vineyards much as they had for generations. Fishermen cast their nets into the same waters that had once borne Phoenician ships. In the cities, merchants haggled in a medley of tongues. French, Arabic, Greek, and Italian blending in the market air. At night, the sound of church bells mingled with the muezzin's call, each speaking its own truth to the stars. The Crusader nobles, though far from home, sought to recreate the order of Europe. They built stone keeps overlooking valleys, established feudal hierarchies, and minted coins bearing crosses and Latin inscriptions. But power here was more precarious. Every stronghold stood isolated by miles of open desert, every road vulnerable to ambush. Rulers learned to rely on diplomacy as much as arms, forming pacts with neighboring emirs and tribes. In this way, the Latin East was as much a land of negotiation as of faith. In time, pilgrims from Europe began to trickle eastward, their arrival greeted with ceremony. Some came in penance, others in wonder, and many returned with tales that would fill Europe's imagination for generations. They spoke of palm trees and deserts, of holy relics and strange customs, of a world where sunrise painted the domes of Jerusalem in gold. To them, the Latin East was not a frontier, it was a bridge to heaven. But beneath the surface of prosperity, the fragility remained. The Crusader states depended heavily on reinforcements from Europe, yet distance and disinterest often left them isolated. The sea was their lifeline, the deserts their peril. Within a generation, they would learn that survival in the East required more than faith, it demanded understanding. The Latin settlers who thrived were those who adapted. Some intermarried with local Christians, others learned the languages of diplomacy. They borrowed medical knowledge, agricultural techniques, and architectural styles from their neighbors. The Crusader castles that still stand today, massive and graceful, with layered walls and cool inner chambers, are testaments to that exchange, blending European design with Eastern ingenuity. For a brief moment in history, it seemed that a new kind of world might emerge from this meeting of cultures, a world where faith could coexist with curiosity. But such balance is rare and fleeting. Beyond the horizon, new leaders were rising in the Islamic world, men who would soon rekindle unity and purpose. The truce between Cross and Crescent would not last. Yet during those early decades, before the great storms returned, the Latin East lived in a strange peace, a fragile miracle held together by trade, prayer, and the will to endure. It was a place where pilgrims walked beside merchants, where monks and warriors shared the same roads, and where every sunrise over the walls of Jerusalem reminded the settlers that they were living upon the edge of eternity. And so, under the wide skies of the Holy Land, the kingdoms of the Cross endured, precarious, luminous, and unlike anything Europe had ever known. For a time, at least, the dream still lived. Part 6, The Muslim Response, Saladin's Rise and the Call for Unity. In the decades after the Crusaders carved their kingdoms into the soil of the East, the Islamic world stirred restlessly, as if waking from a long and troubled dream. The loss of Jerusalem had been more than a political shock, it was a wound that reached into the heart of faith itself. To the scholars and poets of Damascus, to the merchants of Cairo, to the imams who spoke at dawn prayers in Aleppo, the city of Al-Quds was not just stone and sand. It was memory, meaning, and devotion intertwined. But the Islamic world of the 12th century was a house divided. Power lay scattered among rival dynasties, the Seljuks in Anatolia and Persia, the Fatimids in Egypt, and smaller emirates across Syria and Mesopotamia. Loyalties were tangled, alliances shifted like wind in the desert. Even the call to recover Jerusalem, though passionate, lacked a single voice to carry it. For nearly half a century, the Crusader states endured largely because their opponents were divided by language, sect, and ambition. And yet, beneath the surface of this fragmentation, a slow transformation began. The idea of unity, both political and spiritual, started to reawaken. Preachers spoke of the Ummah, the community of believers, reminding listeners that their strength lay in solidarity. Scholars preserved the memory of what had been lost but also sowed seeds of hope, writing that divine justice might one day restore balance. Out of this longing, and from the edges of empire, new leaders began to emerge. Among them was a man whose name would soon resonate far beyond the borders of his time, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin. He was born in 1137 or 1138 in Tikrit, a small town on the banks of the Tigris River, into a Kurdish family of military service. His early life gave no hint of the legend he would become. He was not a warrior in his youth but a scholar at heart, educated in the ways of religion, mathematics, and philosophy. He loved the poetry of Persia, the teachings of the Quran, and the art of conversation. Yet the age into which he was born would draw even the thoughtful into the orbit of power. Saladin's uncle, Shirkuh, served under the great Syrian ruler Nur ad-Din, who governed from Damascus and sought to unite the Muslim world under justice and discipline. Nur ad-Din was a man of faith and focus, stern but visionary. He built schools and hospitals, patronized scholars, and saw governance as a form of service. His vision of unity laid the groundwork for what was to come. When Egypt, still ruled by the weakening Fatimid Caliphate, became embroiled in internal strife, Nur ad-Din sent Shirkuh and his young nephew Saladin to intervene. What began as a campaign to secure an ally became the crucible in which Saladin's destiny was forged. In Cairo, Saladin encountered a world unlike any he had known. A city of scholars and merchants, of golden mosques and markets fragrant with spices. Here, amid the fading light of the Fatimids, he displayed a quiet strength. When his uncle died, Saladin assumed command. He was cautious, modest, and methodical, more inclined to diplomacy than war, but his competence shone through. In time, he won the trust of both soldiers and citizens. By 1171, he had brought Egypt under his control, ending the Fatimid Caliphate and restoring allegiance to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. It was a symbolic act as much as a political one, a gesture of unity across the Islamic world. From that moment, the dream of reconquest ceased to be distant longing and began to take shape as strategy. Yet Saladin's genius lay not merely in power but in patience. He understood that the road to Jerusalem was not only one of armies but of hearts and minds. He rebuilt Egypt's administration, restored justice to its courts, and revived trade and learning. He sought to govern by example, emphasizing mercy over fear. Chroniclers describe him as generous to scholars and kind to the poor, a ruler who prayed by night and dispensed justice by day. His demeanor was calm, his ambition concealed beneath humility. Meanwhile, in Syria, Nur ad-Din continued to strengthen his rule. The two men shared a vision but operated in different spheres. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, Saladin moved swiftly to preserve the unity they had both sought. Through careful diplomacy and, when necessary, force, he brought Damascus, Aleppo, and Mosul under his authority. In doing so, he became the first ruler since the great caliphs of old to unite Egypt and Syria under one banner. The Muslim world watched with cautious hope. For the first time in generations, a single leader commanded enough trust and legitimacy to speak in its name. Saladin did not present himself as a conqueror but as a restorer of order. He called for renewal of faith, for compassion toward the weak, and for steadfastness in the face of adversity. To his contemporaries, he embodied the very virtues that the age demanded: piety, justice, and magnanimity. From the Crusader states, however, his rise did not go unnoticed. The lords of Jerusalem and Antioch, long accustomed to dealing with rival emirs, now faced a unified power whose reach extended from the Nile to the Euphrates. Yet in those early years, Saladin preferred negotiation to battle. He renewed truces, exchanged envoys, and even allowed Christian pilgrims safe passage to holy sites. To him, strength lay in stability. Victory was meaningless if it led only to endless bloodshed. Still, history has its own tides. Border raids and broken treaties rekindled tensions, and both sides began to prepare for the inevitable. Saladin's call for unity took on a new tone, not of vengeance, but of restoration. He spoke of reclaiming Jerusalem not as conquest, but as duty, a trust between the faithful and their Creator. His words echoed far beyond his own lands, carried by poets and travelers who saw in him not just a ruler, but a symbol of renewal. To the chroniclers of his time, Saladin represented something rare, a leader who combined discipline with grace. In an age of ambition, he was remembered for restraint. In an era defined by war, he sought peace where he could find it. He saw governance as stewardship, power as service. Those who met him, Christian and Muslim alike, remarked on his courtesy, his generosity, and his calm dignity. Under his leadership, Egypt and Syria flourished. Roads became safe, scholars returned to the cities, and trade revived across the deserts. The Islamic world, long divided, began to find its voice again. And though the great confrontation that would one day come between Saladin and the armies of the West still lay ahead, his true legacy had already begun to take root. The rebirth of unity in a land that had known too long the weight of division. As twilight fell across the lands of the East, the call of the muezzin drifted from the minarets of Cairo, Damascus, and Aleppo, mingling with the hum of markets and the whisper of palm leaves. In that hour, the cities of Islam breathed with a shared rhythm once more. The world had shifted again, quietly but profoundly. And in the calm before the next storm of history, a new sense of purpose settled over the East, a resolve not born of hatred, but of remembrance, faith, and the hope that light might yet return to the city they had lost. Part 7: The Fall of Jerusalem and the Third Crusade. In the final decades of the 12th century, the fragile balance that had kept peace between the Crusader states and their neighbors began to waver. For nearly a generation, truces had been struck, envoys exchanged, and pilgrims allowed to pass. Trade continued across borders, and some Latin nobles even formed bonds of friendship or kinship with Muslim rulers. Yet beneath this surface calm, history was quietly shifting again. By the 1180s, the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem was no longer the vigorous power it had once been. The early zeal of the Crusaders had given way to complacency. Generations born in the East had grown accustomed to the rhythms of the land. Many no longer saw themselves as pilgrims but as settlers. Politics fractured between competing factions. Some favored diplomacy with Saladin, others demanded renewed holy war. The death of strong rulers and the rise of inexperienced ones left the kingdom vulnerable at a time when its most formidable adversary was uniting the lands around it. Saladin, now Sultan of Egypt and Syria, watched these developments with patience and care. For years he had maintained truces with the Latin states, recognizing that peace allowed his own realm to flourish. But as raids along the borders grew more frequent, some instigated by ambitious Crusader lords, the fragile order began to unravel. The most notorious of these was led by Reinald of Chatillon, a knight whose attacks on Muslim caravans and even pilgrims heading to Mecca violated every treaty that had been sworn. When news of Reinald's provocations reached Cairo and Damascus, outrage spread across the Muslim world. To Saladin, it was no longer a question of politics, but of duty. The time had come to restore balance and justice. Yet even as he prepared his armies, he sought to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. His letters to his emirs and commanders reveal a man who believed deeply in divine purpose, but also in restraint. He wrote that war was a burden, not a glory, and that mercy was the truest mark of faith. In the summer of 1187, fate and momentum converged. The forces of the Kingdom of Jerusalem gathered under King Guy of Lusignan, while Saladin's armies advanced north from Damascus. The encounter that followed, known to history as the Battle of Hattin, shattered the Crusader army and opened the road to Jerusalem. Within weeks, the cities of the kingdom began to fall one by one. By early October, Saladin's banners appeared on the horizon of the Holy City. For the first time in nearly 90 years, Jerusalem faced a new siege. Yet unlike the storms of the past, this one would unfold not in fire and fury, but in negotiation and dignity. Inside the city, the defenders were led by Balian of Ibelin, a noble of courage and composure. He knew that resistance could only delay the inevitable. The walls were strong but the garrison small, supplies were scarce, and the will of the people was exhausted. Still, he resolved to seek honorable terms rather than abandon the city to despair. Saladin, camped outside the walls, agreed to parley. The chroniclers of both sides record their meeting with a kind of quiet reverence. They spoke not as enemies but as men who understood the weight of what stood between them. For Balian, Jerusalem was the sacred heart of Christendom, for Saladin, it was the third holiest site of Islam. Each saw in the other a mirror of devotion. The terms they reached were remarkable for their humanity. The Christian inhabitants would be allowed to ransom their freedom and leave safely. Those who could not pay would not be harmed. Saladin promised protection for women, children, and the poor. Churches would be respected, pilgrims permitted to remain, and the city itself restored to peace. It was, in many ways, the fulfillment of Saladin's long-held belief that conquest was meaningless without compassion. On the morning of October 2, 1187, Jerusalem opened its gates. Chroniclers describe scenes of quiet sorrow and awe as the banners of Islam were raised above the city once more. The cross that had crowned the dome of the rock was gently taken down and replaced with the crescent moon, not in triumphal cruelty but in solemn ceremony. The city that had seen centuries of conquest and prayer returned again to Muslim stewardship. The news spread swiftly across the world. In Europe, it arrived like a thunderclap. The fall of Jerusalem, unthinkable, inconceivable, stirred both grief and fury. Bells tolled across cathedrals, kings and popes alike wept at the thought of the holy city lost. For many, it felt as though the heart of Christendom itself had been taken. Pope Gregory VIII, who had only recently ascended to the papacy, issued a call for renewal, a new crusade to recover the sacred places. His message spread across Christendom, letters carried from monastery to palace, from bishop to king. The words were sober yet urgent, reminding the faithful that faith demanded endurance, not despair. From this call arose what history would call the Third Crusade. It would be led by the mightiest rulers of Europe, Richard I of England, known to legend as the Lionheart, Philip II of France, and the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa. Their names alone carried the promise of power and prestige. Yet even their grandeur could not eclipse the image of Saladin, whose restraint and generosity had already captured the imagination of both East and West. While Europe prepared for war, the East breathed a sigh of fragile peace. Saladin entered Jerusalem not as a conqueror, but as a caretaker. He ordered that the Christian holy sites be protected. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained open to pilgrims, the bells still rang, though more softly now. The mosques were restored to prayer, the streets cleaned and repaired. In the weeks that followed, families reunited, merchants reopened their stalls, and the city slowly returned to life. For the first time in living memory, Jerusalem belonged to no single people, it was shared, if only briefly, in spirit. The Muslim poets of Damascus celebrated the return of Al-Quds with verses that spoke of mercy and divine justice. In Europe, chroniclers mourned but also wrote of admiration. Even in defeat, they recognized Saladin as a man of honor. His name became legend not only among his own people, but among those he had opposed. Knights returning from the East told stories of his fairness, his courtesy, and his compassion, a rarity in an age accustomed to cruelty. Thus, the fall of Jerusalem in 1187 marked both an end and a beginning. It closed the first chapter of Latin rule in the Holy Land, but opened another defined not by hatred, but by dialogue and respect. The clash of civilizations had produced, in its paradoxical way, a shared code of chivalry that would shape centuries to come. As autumn faded, the city settled into its new rhythm. The calls to prayer mingled again with the sound of church bells. Pilgrims continued to arrive, carrying hope across dusty roads. The Holy Land, for all its history of struggle, remained what it had always been, a place of longing, reflection, and faith. And somewhere beyond the horizon, ships began to prepare for their voyage east, bearing the kings of Europe who would soon arrive to meet the Sultan who had become, to friend and foe alike, the embodiment of honor itself. Part 8, Richard and Saladin, Two Legends, One War. When the news of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe, it was as though the sun itself had dimmed. Kings laid aside quarrels, monasteries filled with prayers, and poets wrote of the holy city in mourning tones. But among those who heard the call to recover it, one name rose above all others: Richard Plantagenet, the Lionheart of England. He was the son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, born into the age of chivalry yet molded by ambition and pride. Even as a prince, he had been restless and brilliant. A warrior poet fluent in the languages of power and verse. When he took the cross in 1188, he did so not as a pious pilgrim, but as a king who saw in the crusade both a holy duty and the stage upon which his legend might be written. By 1190, fleets assembled in the ports of the West. The kings of Europe, Richard of England, Philip of France, and the aged Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, set out to reclaim the Holy Land. Yet fate, as always, played its hand. Barbarossa drowned in Asia Minor, his army scattering in grief. Philip and Richard quarreled in Sicily, their alliance already strained by rivalry. By the time Richard reached the coast of the Levant, the weight of the enterprise had fallen largely upon his shoulders. Saladin, meanwhile, ruled with quiet authority from Damascus. He had spent the years since Jerusalem's capture consolidating his realm, strengthening the fragile unity that bound Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia together. Though he expected the Crusaders' return, he hoped for peace. His letters to European rulers and clerics reveal a man who preferred diplomacy to destruction, one who saw in Jerusalem not a prize, but a trust from God. When Richard's fleet appeared off the coast in 1191, it was as if two worlds had come face to face, the Night King from the distant isles of the west and the Sultan whose empire stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates. They would never meet in person, yet their names would become inseparable, bound together in the tapestry of legend. The campaign that followed was long and arduous. The Christian army advanced along the Mediterranean coast, reclaiming cities and strongholds, each victory bought not only with struggle but with endurance. Yet beneath the surface of war lay a thread of admiration. From the first encounters, Richard and Saladin regarded one another with respect rare even among enemies. They exchanged gifts through emissaries, horses, fruit, medicines, and falcons. When Richard fell ill with fever, Saladin sent his own physician and cooling fruit to ease his suffering. When Saladin's brother was captured, Richard treated him with courtesy, allowing his freedom in due time. To chroniclers of both faiths, these gestures became symbols of something larger than conflict, an unspoken acknowledgement that honor transcended borders. For though each saw the other as an obstacle to divine purpose, both were bound by a shared code of chivalry, a recognition that greatness of spirit could dwell even in one's foe. Richard's charisma and courage were undeniable. Chroniclers describe him leading his men not from behind but from the front, his presence on the field inspiring devotion and awe. To his followers, he was the embodiment of the crusading ideal, bold, brilliant, and unyielding. To Saladin's observers, he was formidable yet fair, fierce yet governed by reason. They called him Melek Rik, the king of the Franks, and though they opposed him, they spoke of him with a kind of wary admiration. The months turned into years. Each side gained and lost, yet neither could deliver a final blow. The city of Acre was taken, but Jerusalem remained beyond reach. Saladin knew that time and patience were his allies, Richard knew that distance and obligation were his limits. The two men corresponded through envoys, negotiating truces and testing the boundaries of possibility. In these exchanges, there emerged a strange rapport, two rulers separated by faith, yet united by pragmatism and mutual esteem. The stories that arose from their encounters became legend. Some later chroniclers claimed that Richard proposed marrying his sister to Saladin's brother, joining their houses in peace. Others told of shared laughter over gifts, of falcons exchanged in token of respect. Though these tales blur history and imagination, they reflect something true about the age, that even amid the fires of faith, humanity endured. Saladin, for his part, remained composed and devout. His contemporaries wrote that he never allowed pride to eclipse humility. Each dawn, before attending to affairs of state, he prayed, reciting verses that spoke of mercy and patience. His strength lay not in cruelty, but in endurance, the quiet assurance that justice would prevail in time. Richard, by contrast, burned like the sun, brilliant, impulsive, and restless. His courage was as fierce as his temper, and his victories often dazzling. But he was also weary. The burdens of kingship at home, the exhaustion of years abroad, and the endless tension between faith and fatigue wore upon him. Both he and Saladin came to see that no lasting peace could be born of endless siege. By 1192, after countless campaigns, negotiations resumed in earnest. Neither ruler had achieved complete victory, yet both recognized the futility of continued war. The treaty they agreed upon was modest but monumental. The Crusaders would retain control of a narrow coastal strip, including the city of Acre, while Jerusalem would remain under Muslim rule. Christian pilgrims, however, would be permitted safe passage to the Holy City without fear or hindrance. It was, in the end, a compromise between two visions, the preservation of faith and the acknowledgement of humanity. When the treaty was signed, neither man gloated nor despaired. Saladin and Richard, though never meeting face to face, had forged something rarer than conquest, mutual respect. As Richard prepared to depart for home, he sent word to Saladin expressing gratitude for his fairness. The Sultan, in turn, sent him gifts for his journey, fruit, water, and fine cloth. Chroniclers wrote that when Saladin heard of Richard's departure, he sighed deeply and said he hoped they might meet again as friends. When Saladin himself died the following year, in 1193, the world mourned him not as a tyrant, but as a man of integrity. Even in Europe, churches prayed for his soul. The Third Crusade had changed little on the map, but it had transformed the imagination of two civilizations. For Europeans, Richard became the knight without equal, the lion-hearted king who had faced the East with courage and grace. For the Islamic world, Saladin became the exemplar of justice and piety, a ruler who embodied the ideal of strength tempered by mercy. Across the centuries, their stories intertwined like two strands of the same thread, proof that even in times of conflict, honor could bridge the chasm between faiths. When the dust of the Crusades began to settle, the legends of Richard and Saladin continued to grow, carried by travelers, poets, and historians. In their rivalry, the world glimpsed something greater than victory, the possibility that mutual respect, born even in opposition, could outlast war itself. And so, as the sea winds carried Richard's ships back toward the west and Saladin's city of Damascus settled into mourning for its lost ruler, the echoes of their encounter remained, a testament not to the triumph of arms, but to the endurance of character. In their story, history found its balance, the fierce light of courage and the gentle glow of wisdom, standing side by side in the twilight of an age that had sought heaven through struggle, and found instead a fragment of understanding. Part 9, Between Cross and Crescent, Diplomacy and Division. When the ships bearing Richard the Lionheart vanished over the horizon, the Holy Land seemed to exhale. After nearly a century of conflict, a fragile peace settled across its cities and deserts. It was not the peace of victory or surrender, but something quieter, an uneasy truce born of exhaustion and understanding. The Third Crusade had ended without triumph for either side, yet in its wake, both the Christian West and the Islamic East found themselves forever changed. Saladin's death in 1193 left behind more than an empire, it left a legacy. His vision of unity had given the Muslim world its voice again, and though his successors could not match his charisma, they inherited his example. Egypt and Syria remained bound together under the Ayyubid dynasty, ruled by his family. They governed with a blend of pragmatism and faith, continuing his efforts to maintain stability and prosperity. The holy places, so often caught in the crossfire of ambition, were now tended with care. The city of Jerusalem itself, though no longer in Christian hands, became once more a place of coexistence. In the years following the peace treaty, Christian pilgrims continued to travel eastward, their journey no longer one of conquest but of devotion. They walked the same paths as before, the road from Jaffa to Jerusalem, the winding hills of Galilee, the quiet gardens of Gethsemane. The Muslim authorities honored Saladin's promise, allowing these travelers to visit the sacred sites in safety. For many pilgrims, the experience was humbling. They had heard tales of war and division, but what they found was a city alive with prayer in many tongues, a crossroads of faith rather than its battlefield. Trade, too, began to flourish once more. The ports of Acre, Tyre, and Alexandria became conduits not only for goods, but for ideas. Venetian and Genoese merchants established colonies along the coast, their ships carrying spices, textiles, glass, and stories between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. In their wake came scholars, translators, and physicians. The old barriers between worlds grew thinner. The Latin settlers who remained in the Crusader enclaves began to adopt local customs, building homes in Eastern style, learning Arabic, and participating in the rhythms of Levantine life. From Damascus to Marseille, from Cairo to Venice, there arose a subtle, invisible web of exchange. The flow of books and learning that had once been interrupted by war resumed. Works of Aristotle and Galen, preserved and expanded by Arab scholars, made their way into European libraries, transforming Western thought. Algebra, astronomy, and medicine crossed seas alongside silk and sugar. The age of Crusades, born of zeal, had inadvertently become an age of connection. Yet this peace was not without tension. The Christian West, though outwardly subdued, still carried the dream of Jerusalem deep in its heart. Preachers continued to speak of the Holy Land as a sacred duty unfulfilled. The memory of Saladin's victory lingered as both inspiration and grievance. Kings and popes called for renewed crusades, but the passion that had once united Christendom began to fade. The Fourth Crusade, called in 1202, revealed how far that ideal had fallen. Instead of marching east to reclaim the Holy City, the Crusaders turned their arms against Constantinople, the greatest Christian city of the East. The sack of that city in 1204 shocked the world. Churches burned, treasures were looted, and the schism between the Latin and Greek churches deepened beyond repair. The cause that had once sought to defend Christendom now divided it. Meanwhile, in the East, the successors of Saladin faced their own struggles. The unity he had forged began to fragment. His sons and nephews, though pious, quarreled over inheritance and pride. The Ayyubid domain splintered into semi-independent principalities, Damascus, Aleppo, Cairo, each ruled by kin yet divided by ambition. And though they remained stronger than the Crusader states, the spirit of common purpose began to wane. Still, amid the ebb and flow of politics, a quieter current endured. Muslim chroniclers of the time wrote not only of battles and treaties but of shared humanity. They described how the Franks, once strangers from distant lands, had become part of the region's tapestry. Some even admired their discipline and resilience, while others marveled at their curiosity and skill in fortification. In return, European travelers brought home tales of Eastern learning, architecture, and refinement. The 12th and 13th centuries thus became an era of paradox, of division on the surface, but exchange beneath. The Holy Land, so long the focus of contention, evolved into a place where boundaries blurred. Monks and scholars translated Arabic texts into Latin, Muslim architects studied the defensive designs of Crusader castles. Across the Mediterranean, knowledge moved faster than armies ever could. And yet, despite these bridges, the shadow of faith's rivalry remained. Both worlds still defined themselves in part by the other. In Europe, the image of the Saracen lingered in sermons and songs, half fear and half fascination. In the Islamic world, the memory of the Franks, brave, foreign, often misunderstood, persisted as a reminder of both peril and potential. There were moments of mutual recognition even in myth. In troubadour poems of Provence, Saladin appeared as a symbol of noble virtue, admired for his generosity. In Islamic chronicles, Richard the Lionheart was remembered not merely as an enemy, but as a worthy adversary. Such stories softened the edges of memory, shaping an understanding that history itself might one day bridge the distance that faith had widened. By the middle of the 13th century, the Crusader states had become shadows of their former selves, small coastal enclaves held by dwindling forces, more reliant on diplomacy than devotion. Yet their presence endured, and so did the patterns of trade and culture that had once been born of conflict. In cities like Acre, one could hear Latin, Arabic, Greek, and French spoken in the same marketplace. Merchants from Italy bartered beside Bedouin traders, monks debated philosophy with Muslim scholars under the shade of olive trees. This was the strange inheritance of the Crusades, not only walls and wounds, but the mingling of minds. The wars that had begun with a cry for holy deliverance had, by slow and circuitous paths, led to the rediscovery of shared humanity. But it was a fragile coexistence. Beyond the horizon, new powers were rising, the Mongols from the steppes of Central Asia, and in Egypt, the Mamluks, warrior slaves who would soon seize the mantle of leadership and defend Islam with renewed zeal. The old world that Richard and Saladin had known was fading, giving way to a harsher, more pragmatic age. For the moment, however, the Holy Land rested in a rare stillness. The waves of war had ebbed, leaving behind the quiet traces of connection. In Jerusalem, pilgrims of both faiths continued to walk its streets, their prayers rising into the same sky. In the markets of Acre, merchants weighed goods beneath the same sun that once glinted off the armor of kings. The memory of conquest had not vanished, but time had softened it, like sea glass worn smooth by the tide. And as evening descended over the hills of Judea, one might imagine the echo of bells and the call to prayer sounding together, faint, overlapping, and timeless. The wars of faith had ended, for a while, but the conversation between civilizations endured, carried not by armies, but by the patient rhythm of history itself. Part 10, The Last Crusades, Faith Fading into Memory. As the 13th century unfolded, the once burning flame of the Crusades began to flicker. The great rallies of faith that had sent waves of knights and pilgrims across continents were now memories fading into the mists of time. The world had changed. Trade had taken the place of conquest, and diplomacy, for all its frailty, had begun to bind distant peoples in ways that swords no longer could. Yet the dream of the Holy Land endured. In monasteries and palaces, preachers still spoke of Jerusalem with longing. The scars of the past had not erased the idea that it might once again be brought under Christian rule. The papacy, seeing the Crusades as both a spiritual mission and a unifying cause, continued to issue calls to arms. But where once kings had answered, now only fragments of armies gathered. The fervor that had driven the First and Third Crusades could not be rekindled. The Fourth Crusade had already changed everything. Its diversion to Constantinople in 1204 was an act that shattered the illusion of unity in Christendom. For the first time, Christians had turned their swords not against Islam, but against one another. The city that had stood as the bastion of the Eastern faith for nearly 1,000 years was taken, plundered, and left scarred. The rift between East and West, between the Latin and Greek churches, widened into an abyss. The memory of that tragedy would linger long after the soldiers themselves had vanished. Still, new expeditions were launched, each smaller, less certain, less pure in purpose. The Fifth Crusade, 1217 to 1221, turned its attention to Egypt, seen as the key to regaining the Holy Land. But the Nile proved mightier than the cross. Floods, disease, and misjudgment led to failure. The Sixth Crusade, 1228 to 1229, led by the remarkable Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire, would succeed in a way that none before him had imagined, through words instead of war. Frederick was a scholar as much as a ruler, a man of reason in an age of passion. Fluent in Arabic, fascinated by science and philosophy, he had long corresponded with Muslim thinkers. When he journeyed east, it was not to wage battle, but to negotiate. In a move that stunned Europe, he met with the Sultan of Egypt, Al-Kamil, a nephew of Saladin. The two men, both intellectuals, spoke not in threats but in ideas. They reached a peaceful agreement. Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth would be returned to Christian control for a decade, on the condition that Muslim holy sites remain untouched. It was a triumph of diplomacy, though one born of mutual weariness. For a brief time, Jerusalem was once again shared, its gates open to both pilgrims and traders. Yet even this peace could not last. Within 15 years, the truce dissolved, undone by mistrust and ambition. Still, the Sixth Crusade remains one of history's quiet marvels, a rare moment when wisdom prevailed where force had failed. The later Crusades drifted farther from their origins. The Seventh and Eighth, led by the pious French King Louis IX, aimed once again at Egypt and North Africa but ended in disaster. Louis himself was captured, ransomed, and later died on another ill-fated expedition. The age of crusading kings was over. What had begun as a movement of sacred unity had become a series of isolated campaigns, each smaller and more uncertain than the last. As the decades passed, the remaining Crusader states shrank like islands eroding in the tide. Acre, the great coastal stronghold, became their last bastion, a city of merchants, mercenaries, and monks. Its harbors bustled with trade, but beneath the prosperity lay a sense of finality. The kings of Europe had turned their attention elsewhere, to wars at home, to dynastic struggles, to the rise of new nations. The East, once the center of Christendom's imagination, was becoming distant again. In 1291, Acre fell to the Mamluks, the powerful new dynasty that had risen in Egypt. The city's fall marked the end of 2 centuries of Crusader presence in the Holy Land. The banners of the cross were lowered from its towers, and the last ships bearing knights and families slipped westward over the dark waters of the Mediterranean. The dream that had once consumed generations of Europe had finally come to rest. Yet the Crusades did not truly vanish. Their echoes remained in memory, in art, and in language. Pilgrimage did not cease, it changed. The roads that had once carried armies now carried traders and scholars. In the cities of Italy and Spain, in Paris and Cairo, in Damascus and Venice, the legacy of contact between worlds continued to shape the future. For the Islamic world, the end of the Crusades brought a return to focus and renewal. The Mamluks fortified Egypt and Syria, repelling both Mongols and European adventurers. They restored the great mosques, strengthened trade routes, and turned Cairo into a city of brilliance, a crossroads of Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean. To them, the Crusades had been an era of trial, now overcome. For Europe, the story was more complex. The Crusades had expanded horizons, literally and intellectually. They had opened roads of commerce, awakened curiosity about distant lands, and introduced the West to the wisdom of Greek, Arab, and Persian scholars. From the libraries of Toledo to the lecture halls of Paris, knowledge that had once lain hidden in the East now reshaped the minds of the West. The failures of the later Crusades also carried lessons. Europe learned, slowly, that faith imposed by force could not endure. The encounters with the East had revealed both kinship and difference, inspiring a new awareness of a wider world. The maps of the 13th century began to fill with detail, rivers traced from travelers' tales, stars charted by borrowed instruments. The seeds of exploration, of curiosity, of Renaissance thought, were already taking root. And so, the age of crusading faded not in defeat, but in transformation. The banners fell, but the bridges remained. The same ships that once carried soldiers now bore silk, spices, and manuscripts. The same ports that had echoed with prayers for conquest now thrived with the hum of commerce. The Holy Land itself, ever resilient, continued to welcome those who came not with armies, but with reverence. In the long twilight of the 13th century, the memory of the Crusades settled into legend. The songs of knights and pilgrims turned wistful, their verses less about victory than about the passage of time. Chroniclers wrote of kings and sultans as figures of myth, Richard and Saladin, Louis and Al-Kamil, their names now softened by distance, their struggles reimagined as moral parables rather than political history. By the dawn of the 14th century, Europe had changed beyond recognition. New powers were rising, new voyages were being planned, and new philosophies were stirring. Yet somewhere, deep in the heart of memory, the echo of the Crusades remained, not as a cry for war, but as a reminder of humanity's restless yearning for meaning, for belonging, for connection across the boundaries it so often creates. And perhaps, in that sense, the Crusades never truly ended. They lived on not in banners or battles, but in the exchange of ideas and the endurance of stories, reminders that even in an age of division, the world was always more intertwined than its people imagined. As dusk fell over the Mediterranean, one could almost hear the whisper of waves against forgotten harbors, carrying with them the faint echoes of prayers in many tongues, Latin, Arabic, Greek, each lifted toward the same endless sky. The age of faith and fury had passed. In its place rose the slow, unending rhythm of remembrance. The long memory of a world forever changed by its own yearning for the divine. Part 11, The Echoes of the Crusades, Europe's Transformation. When the last Crusader ship slipped quietly from the harbors of the East in 1291, the Mediterranean seemed to draw a deep breath and fall still. 2 centuries of holy war had ended not with triumph or ceremony, but with a quiet withdrawal, the kind that leaves behind silence heavy with reflection. The wars that had once defined the dreams of popes and kings were over, yet their echoes were only beginning to shape what Europe would become. In the decades that followed, the Crusades faded from living memory but not from the world's fabric. Their impact was written not on maps, but in habits of thought, in commerce, and in the restless pulse of discovery that began to stir across the continent. The soldiers and pilgrims who had marched east returned with more than relics or tales of battle, they brought back new ways of seeing. They had glimpsed a wider world, one of immense diversity and sophistication, and in doing so, Europe had found itself at a crossroads. From the ports of Venice and Genoa to the cathedrals of Paris and Cologne, change arrived quietly but decisively. The Crusades had opened channels of trade that Northwest subsequent war could close. Caravans once guarded by armed escorts now carried spices, silks, glass, and dyes. Italian merchants established permanent ties with the markets of Alexandria and Damascus. The Mediterranean became a highway not for armies, but for exchange. Ships that had once borne knights now carried books, medicine, and mathematics. This influx of goods brought prosperity, but it also brought curiosity. The knowledge preserved and expanded by Muslim and Byzantine scholars during Europe's darker centuries now returned across the sea like sunlight filtering into a long-closed room. Greek philosophy, rediscovered through Arabic translations, began to circulate once more. The works of Aristotle, Euclid, and Galen found eager readers in universities that had only recently been founded. Monks became translators, and merchants became patrons of learning. The intellectual transformation that followed was slow but profound. The scholastic movement, led by thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, sought to reconcile faith with reason, drawing inspiration from the same texts that Muslim philosophers had debated centuries earlier. Medicine advanced as European doctors studied the writings of Avicenna and Al-Razi. Astronomy and mathematics, shaped by Arabic numerals and algebraic reasoning, began to challenge old assumptions. The medieval mind, once content to see the world through the narrow lens of faith alone, started to rediscover the vastness of creation. In this sense, the Crusades had served as unintended teachers. Their failures had humbled Europe, but their encounters had expanded it. Where once the unknown had been feared, it was now studied. Where once the East had been seen only as the land of infidels, it was increasingly regarded as a source of wisdom and wonder. The very people who had marched under the sign of the cross returned to build libraries, universities, and merchant guilds that would sustain the next age of enlightenment. Economically, too, the landscape of Europe shifted. The rise of trading republics like Venice, Pisa, and Genoa owed much to the steady flow of goods from the East. Banking emerged as a necessity to fund these ventures, giving birth to institutions that would one day finance empires. Towns grew into cities, and the balance of power began to shift from feudal lords to merchants and artisans. The Crusades, which had once drained Europe's wealth in the pursuit of holy war, now indirectly fueled its rise to prosperity. Even the Church, though diminished in spiritual authority by the failures of the later Crusades, adapted. Pilgrimage remained a central practice, but it evolved. The Holy Land was no longer the only destination. Shrines within Europe, Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, Rome, became symbolic stand-ins for Jerusalem. Faith had turned inward, becoming more personal, more contemplative. The Church began to focus not on reclaiming territory, but on reforming souls. At the same time, Europe's sense of the world grew broader. The Crusades had revealed the limitations of isolation. Through contact with Islamic civilization, Europeans had encountered urban centers of dazzling sophistication, cities with hospitals, observatories, and libraries that dwarfed their own. They saw art and architecture unlike anything they had imagined, and the impression lingered. Within a century, Gothic cathedrals began to rise across Europe, their arches and domes subtly echoing the styles of the East. The exchange was not one-sided, it was cultural osmosis, gradual and profound. The echoes of the Crusades could also be heard in the songs and stories of the age. Troubadours sang of noble knights and distant quests, their verses blending history with dream. The image of the chivalric hero, brave, devout, and courtly, was shaped as much by myth as by memory. It was in these romantic retellings that the Crusades found a second life, transformed from harsh campaigns into ideals of honor and love. Yet not all legacies were noble. The same fervor that had once turned eastward would, in later centuries, turn inward. The habit of holy war, once aimed at distant foes, began to find new targets closer to home: heretics, Jews, and dissenters. The machinery of crusading zeal would evolve into the machinery of persecution. It was one of history's cruel ironies that an age born from religious devotion would sow the seeds of division. Still, the deeper influence of the Crusades was not destruction, but connection. Europe could no longer pretend that it stood apart from the rest of the world. The same seas that had carried armies now bound civilizations together. Mariners from Italy and Catalonia began to venture farther, exploring the coasts of Africa, dreaming of routes to India and beyond. The horizon that had once ended at Jerusalem now stretched endlessly outward. By the 14th century, the memory of the Crusades had softened into legend. Chroniclers recorded their stories with a kind of wistful detachment, not as living history, but as moral reflection. To some, they were cautionary tales about pride and piety; to others, they were evidence of humanity's enduring yearning for transcendence. The cross and crescent no longer clashed on battlefields, but in the imagination, symbols not of war, but of mystery. And yet, even in their ending, the Crusades had achieved something unexpected. They had reminded the world of its shared humanity, of the ways that faith, though often dividing, could also inspire wonder. They had shown that contact, even through conflict, could lead to understanding. The bridges they built were not of stone, but of memory. As evening descended over Europe's new cities, over Venice's canals, Paris's cloisters, and London's crowded markets, a new rhythm replaced the drums of war, the hum of trade, the murmur of learning, the quiet scratching of pens across parchment. The same continent that had once marched toward Jerusalem was now turning inward and forward, preparing unknowingly for a new age, one that would seek heaven not through conquest, but through discovery. And somewhere, deep in the human heart, the memory of the Crusades endured, not as glory, nor as grief, but as a lesson whispered by time itself, that the search for meaning, though fraught with folly, has always bound the world together more than it has torn it apart. Part 12, The Memory of the Crusades in the Islamic World. Long after the banners of the Crusaders had vanished from the walls of the East, their memory lingered across the Islamic world like a distant echo carried by the wind. For the people who had lived through those generations of upheaval, the Crusades were not simply wars, they were an age, a long season of trial that had tested faith, unity, and endurance. And though the scars they left behind were deep, time began to transform them into something more contemplative. Out of the ashes of conflict came renewal, and from memory, understanding. The death of Saladin in 1193 marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. His name remained revered, not only as a conqueror, but as a model of virtue, a ruler who embodied justice, mercy, and discipline. In the years that followed, poets and chroniclers wrote of him with an affection that bordered on sanctity. To them, he was the mirror of Islamic ideals, a leader who defended the faith without cruelty, who wielded power without arrogance, and who showed generosity even to his foes. Under his successors, the Ayyubid dynasty continued to rule much of the Near East, but the vast unity that Saladin had forged slowly unraveled. Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia drifted apart under the competing ambitions of princes and governors. Yet even as the political landscape fractured, the cultural and intellectual revival that had begun during his reign flourished. Cairo, Damascus, and Aleppo became centers not of war, but of learning, sanctuaries for scholars, artists, and theologians who sought to make sense of a world forever changed. For many in the Islamic world, the Crusades became less a story of enemies and more a story of endurance. The chroniclers who recorded them did so not to glorify battle, but to preserve memory, to remind future generations of both loss and resilience. They wrote of bravery, of treachery, of divine justice and human frailty. But above all, they wrote with perspective. Time had cooled the fever of war, reflection had softened its edges. As the 13th century progressed, a new power rose in Egypt, the Mamluks, soldiers of slave origin who seized authority through merit and discipline. Under their rule, the Islamic world regained its confidence. The Mamluks repelled the Mongols, whose westward expansion had threatened to consume all civilization, and in doing so, they preserved the cultural heart of Islam. When Acre fell in 1291, ending the last Crusader stronghold, it was the Mamluks who restored the land fully to Muslim stewardship. Their victory was not celebrated with triumphalism, but with restoration. The holy sites were repaired, the roads reopened to pilgrims, and Jerusalem once more became a city of peace, fragile, imperfect, but enduring. Mosques and churches stood side by side, as they had for centuries, their stones absorbing the prayers of countless generations. The Mamluk sultans patronized scholars and artisans, commissioning schools, hospitals, and libraries. They understood, as Saladin had, that strength lay not only in the sword, but in the mind. The intellectual life of the Islamic world in the post-Crusade centuries was rich and reflective. The scholars of Damascus and Cairo turned their attention to law, philosophy, and theology, seeking to reconcile the demands of reason with the mysteries of revelation. Thinkers such as Ibn Khaldun began to study history not merely as a series of divine tests, but as a science of cause and effect. In his Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun wrote of the rise and fall of empires, of how human societies moved through cycles of vigor and decay. The Crusades, in his view, were but one episode in a greater pattern, a reminder that civilizations are judged not by their conquests, but by their capacity to learn from adversity. Trade and diplomacy resumed with the West, cautiously but steadily. Venetian and Genoese merchants once again filled the harbors of Alexandria and Beirut. The same ships that had carried warriors now carried spices, textiles, and manuscripts. A new generation of travelers and translators crossed between worlds, exchanging not just goods but ideas. The memory of hostility faded into the background, replaced by curiosity and mutual utility. Still, the memory of the Crusades persisted in the collective consciousness, not as a wound that festered, but as a cautionary tale. The Muslim chroniclers remembered the Franks as fierce, stubborn, and courageous, but also naive. They admired their bravery even as they lamented their ignorance. To them, the Crusades revealed both the strength and the folly of human passion. The lessons drawn were moral rather than political, that division among believers invites ruin, and that justice, not vengeance, must be the cornerstone of strength. Jerusalem itself remained the symbol and the mirror of that memory. Travelers who visited it in the centuries after Saladin's time wrote of its calm beauty, its streets lined with pilgrims, its hills golden in the evening light. They described Muslim custodians guiding Christian pilgrims through the holy sites, of quiet exchanges between faiths that once saw each other only as enemies. The city had endured what few others could: conquest, reconquest, and yet another rebirth. Over time, the Islamic world came to view the Crusades less as a singular catastrophe and more as part of a broader tapestry of human striving. The story of faith confronting faith became, in reflection, a meditation on fate and humility. For if the Crusaders had come believing themselves instruments of divine will, so too had those who opposed them. The result was not the triumph of one over the other, but the revelation that history itself belongs to no single people. In the courts of later sultans and caliphs, the memory of the Crusades was evoked not to stir resentment, but to inspire vigilance and virtue. Preachers reminded their congregations that unity must be tended like a garden, lest it fall again to division. Scholars used the example of Saladin's justice as a moral compass for rulers. Even poets found meaning in the contrast between war and peace, writing verses that transformed pain into wisdom. The Crusades, in this way, became a mirror through which the Islamic world examined itself, a reflection of both vulnerability and strength. They had revealed the dangers of fragmentation, but also the resilience of faith. They had shown the cruelty of zeal, but also the mercy of restraint. Above all, they had reminded the faithful that endurance, not conquest, is the true measure of civilization. As centuries passed, the memory of those distant wars faded into the rhythm of daily life. The great cities of the East continued to thrive. Cairo's markets bustled with traders, Damascus glowed with lanterns and laughter, Jerusalem remained serene beneath its domes and minarets. Time had softened what once burned so fiercely. The swords had rusted, but their lessons endured. And so, as evening fell over the lands once contested by crusaders and sultans alike, a kind of quiet reconciliation settled in, not the reconciliation of treaties, but of understanding. History had moved on, but its memory remained, whispering softly to those who cared to listen, that even in conflict, humanity reveals both its frailty and its grace. In that whisper lay the truest legacy of the Crusades for the Islamic world, not bitterness, not triumph, but remembrance, the enduring awareness that the struggle between faiths had always been, in the end, a struggle within the human soul itself, between pride and compassion, fear and hope, division and peace. Part 13: The Crusades and the Byzantine Decline. In the great mosaic of medieval history, few stories are as haunting as that of Byzantium, the empire that had once been the radiant bridge between East and West. Its walls had guarded the treasures of Rome and the faith of Christendom for 1,000 years. It had survived sieges, plagues, and dynasties, standing as a city of marble and gold between worlds. But by the time the Crusaders first set foot in the East, Byzantium was already a kingdom of contradictions, proud yet weakened, glorious yet fragile. When Pope Urban II issued his call for the First Crusade in 1095, he had done so in response to a plea for help from the Byzantine Emperor, Alexios I Komnenos. The Seljuk Turks had overrun much of Anatolia, and Constantinople stood vulnerable. What Alexios expected was aid, disciplined soldiers to reinforce his armies, a temporary alliance to repel the invaders. What arrived, instead, was something he could not have foreseen, a flood of faith-driven warriors from across Latin Christendom, burning with zeal, hungry for absolution, and largely beyond his control. From the moment the Crusaders reached the walls of Constantinople, mistrust shadowed their every interaction. To the Byzantines, these newcomers seemed wild and unpredictable, their manners coarse, their Latin speech rough against the polished Greek of the imperial court. To the Crusaders, the Byzantines seemed cunning, effeminate, and too worldly. Christians, yes, but Christians of a different sort. The schism between East and West, formalized in 1054, had left deep scars. Now, under the golden domes of Constantinople, those divisions would quietly shape the fate of empires. The First Crusade succeeded beyond all expectation, and yet its triumph was Byzantium's mixed blessing. The recapture of cities in Anatolia brought short-term relief, but the establishment of independent Crusader states in Syria and Palestine created a new and unpredictable frontier. What Alexios had hoped to reclaim for the empire became semi-autonomous Latin realms, sometimes allies, sometimes rivals. Still, through diplomacy and trade, Byzantium endured. Under Alexios and his son John II, the empire recovered a measure of its former strength. Constantinople remained a jewel of the world, a city of learning, art, and ceremony, where scholars studied Plato while traders sold silks brought from China. But the long threads of history began to tighten in the 12th century. The balance between East and West, always uneasy, began to unravel. Western merchants, particularly the Venetians and Genoese, had been granted privileges in exchange for their naval support, flooding the empire's markets with their ships and goods. Over time, these privileges eroded Byzantine sovereignty, turning trade into dependency. Wealth flowed outward, resentment grew within. The Crusades, which had begun as the empire's salvation, slowly became its undoing. The Second and Third Crusades passed with little direct impact on Byzantium, but the seeds of discord had been planted. Latin arrogance and Greek pride clashed in every alliance. The Byzantines, heirs to 1,000 years of imperial refinement, viewed the Crusaders as untrustworthy barbarians. The Crusaders, for their part, saw the Byzantines as treacherous and lukewarm in their faith. The language of Christendom fractured under the weight of mutual suspicion. Then came the Fourth Crusade, the event that would end Byzantium's golden age forever. What began as an expedition to the Holy Land in 1202 was soon diverted, through a tangle of debt and politics, toward the very heart of the Christian East. Venice, owed vast sums by the Crusaders for their fleet, persuaded them to attack the city of Zara, a Christian port that had rebelled against Venetian control. The attack, condemned by the Pope, was the first omen of tragedy. But worse was to come. A young Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, exiled and desperate to reclaim his throne, promised the Crusaders riches and allegiance if they would help him overthrow his uncle, the reigning emperor in Constantinople. The bargain sealed the empire's fate. In 1204, the armies of the cross turned their gaze toward Constantinople, not in pilgrimage, but in greed. What followed was a moment that shocked the medieval world, the sack of the greatest Christian city on earth by Christian hands. The walls that had defied Persians, Arabs, and Turks for centuries fell to an army meant to defend the faith. For 3 days, the city was looted and desecrated. Churches were stripped of their treasures, libraries burned, relics scattered. The Hagia Sophia, that vast and holy masterpiece of architecture, was desecrated, its altars broken, its icons defiled. When the smoke cleared, the Byzantine Empire was no more. In its place stood the Latin Empire of Constantinople, a hollow imitation ruled by Western nobles. The Greeks fled to the provinces, establishing successor states in Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus. The ancient continuity of the Roman world, unbroken since Augustus, had finally been shattered. For 57 years, the Latin Empire limped along, impoverished and despised. Its rulers could not hold the loyalty of the people or defend its borders. The Greek emperors of Nicaea slowly gathered strength and, in 1261, recaptured Constantinople under Michael VIII Palaiologos. The city was reclaimed, but never recovered. The Byzantium that rose from the ashes was smaller, weaker, and haunted. Its population had dwindled, its economy was strangled by Venetian merchants, its confidence, once unshakable, was gone. Still, the empire endured, a fragile flicker of the old flame. The scholars of Constantinople continued to write, paint, and teach. Its churches echoed with chants that had been sung since the time of Justinian. But outside its walls, the world had changed. The Crusades had weakened Byzantium beyond repair, opening the door to new powers, first the Seljuks, and later, the rising Ottoman Turks. The final centuries of the empire were marked by melancholy grace. Byzantine theologians and philosophers turned inward, seeking solace in faith and contemplation. The empire became less a political power than a spiritual one, a keeper of memory. Its art grew luminous, its icons serene, as though aware that beauty itself was its last defense. When Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453, it did so with a strange dignity. The last emperor, Constantine XI, fought on the walls alongside his soldiers, vanishing into legend as the city that had once ruled an empire became a crown for another civilization. The fall was mourned across Christendom, but for those who understood history, it had been long in coming. The seeds of decline had been planted not by the Turks, but by the betrayal of the Fourth Crusade. And so, in the long memory of the world, the Crusades remain inseparable from Byzantium's fate, a cautionary tale of faith consumed by ambition, of unity lost to mistrust. The empire that had once been the guardian of both Rome and Christ now existed only in memory, its legacy carried westward by scholars who fled its ruins, bringing with them the manuscripts and wisdom that would ignite the Renaissance. Thus, even in death, Byzantium gave birth to renewal. Its fall, born of division, became the wellspring of Europe's rebirth. The Crusades, for all their tragedy, had bound the destinies of East and West in a single thread, one woven of glory, folly, and enduring beauty. As the centuries passed, travelers from Europe who gazed upon the domes of Istanbul, once Constantinople, would still sense something ancient in the air, the ghost of an empire that had outlasted empires, and a lesson whispered softly by time. That even faith, when divided, can become its own undoing, and that greatness, once lost, returns only in remembrance. Part 14, The Cross and the Crescent in Art and Imagination. Long after the trumpets of war had fallen silent, the memory of the Crusades lived on, not in the clamor of soldiers or the echo of battles, but in the quieter languages of art, music, and imagination. Across both Europe and the Islamic world, the legacy of those 2 centuries of contact left marks far deeper than conquest ever could. Where swords had once crossed, ideas began to mingle, where fortresses had fallen, new visions of beauty rose. In the West, the Crusades had begun as a religious mission, but their imagery soon took on a life of its own. The sight of distant lands, strange architecture, and the shimmering light of the East fascinated returning crusaders and pilgrims. They brought back not only relics and stories but new sensibilities, colors brighter than any seen in the cold light of Northern Europe, patterns geometric and endless, and music filled with modes that carried the fragrance of faraway cities. The result was an awakening of imagination that would ripple through every art form. Gothic cathedrals, with their pointed arches and ribbed vaults, owed something subtle to the East. The pointed arch itself, that defining symbol of Gothic architecture, was likely borrowed from the Islamic designs seen in Syria and Egypt. The Crusaders had walked through the mosques of Damascus and the fortresses of Aleppo, and though they came as conquerors, they returned as imitators. In their stone and glass, they sought to capture the same sense of divine light that they had glimpsed beneath Eastern domes. The rose windows of Chartres and Reims, the lace-like carvings of cloisters and capitals, all bore whispers of that distant encounter. In painting and manuscript illumination, too, the influence of the East grew quietly profound. Gold leaf, lapis lazuli, and ultramarine. Pigments imported through the same trade routes once opened by Crusader fleets, transformed Western art. Scenes of the Holy Land became a staple of religious imagery, not only because of devotion, but because they symbolized a bridge between the known and the mysterious. Artists, working from travelers' tales, began to populate their sacred landscapes with palm trees, domed buildings, and robes of silk and crimson. The imagined Orient became a place of both holiness and wonder. Music, that most ethereal of arts, also absorbed new sounds. The Crusades had exposed European ears to instruments and tonalities unknown in the West, the oud, ancestor of the lute, the rebab, a bowed instrument that would give rise to the violin, and rhythmic structures more fluid than the rigid chants of Latin Christendom. Troubadours and minstrels returning from the East carried fragments of melody and story, blending them into the songs of courtly love that would define medieval Europe's emotional life. Many of these songs spoke not of war, but of yearning, of longing for beauty glimpsed and lost, of honor, devotion, and the eternal ache of distance. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, the Crusades stirred artistic reflection of a different kind. Muslim chroniclers and poets did not celebrate war in the way their Western counterparts did, rather, they recorded its lessons, its tragedies, and its revelations. The art of calligraphy, already the highest form of expression in Islamic culture, became a tool of spiritual endurance. Quranic verses inscribed upon the walls of mosques and palaces spoke of patience, mercy, and divine justice. They reminded the faithful that time itself would heal what swords had broken. In architecture, the Islamic world continued to build with a confidence born of resilience. The Mamluk mosques of Cairo, with their slender minarets and intricate stonework, reflected a civilization renewed. Their geometric precision, their balance of shadow and light, were acts of devotion that transcended victory or defeat. Each dome, each arch, each lattice of arabesques proclaimed that beauty itself was a form of worship. In Damascus, Aleppo, and Jerusalem, artisans rebuilt what war had scarred. The Dome of the Rock, once endangered by conflict, was restored and adorned anew with mosaics that shimmered like sunlight on water. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, damaged and repurposed during the Crusader occupation, was cleansed and rededicated to prayer. These acts of restoration were not merely architectural, they were spiritual renewals, testaments to the endurance of faith amid the cycles of history. Cultural exchange flowed quietly in both directions. Textiles, ceramics, and metalwork from the Islamic world found eager patrons in Europe. The so-called Damascened steel, renowned for its strength and beauty, became legend among knights and craftsmen alike. In return, European artisans adapted motifs from Islamic decoration, stars, vines, interlacing geometry, into tapestries, manuscripts, and jewelry. Even the word arabesque, later used to describe European ornament, bore the memory of that influence. Philosophically, too, imagination bridged the divide. The works of Averroes, Ibn Rushd, and Avicenna, Ibn Sina, translated into Latin, reshaped European thought. Their commentaries on Aristotle challenged medieval theologians to reconcile revelation with reason, planting the seeds of the Renaissance centuries before its dawn. The exchange was not always direct or acknowledged, but it was transformative. Through these writings, the wisdom of the East seeped quietly into the fabric of Western consciousness. And while the memory of the Crusades as warfare faded, their image as myth grew stronger. In Europe, knights returning from the East were transformed into figures of legend. Their tales blended history with fantasy. Dragons, miracles, and holy relics mingled with memories of dusty roads and desert skies. The Crusader became not a soldier, but a symbol of courage, faith, and sometimes folly. In the Islamic world, Saladin became the mirror of that mythic knight, the archetype of the noble ruler, wise and merciful. Even centuries later, his name would be spoken in admiration across continents, by Muslims and Christians alike. In art, as in memory, the Crusades thus became less about conquest and more about transformation. They entered the realm of imagination, where conflict softened into parable and difference became fascination. Artists on both sides painted not the clash of faiths, but the enduring mystery of human longing, for heaven, for beauty, for meaning. By the 15th century, the lines between East and West were no longer drawn in blood, but in brushstrokes and melodies. The Renaissance in Europe, that rebirth of classical learning, owed much to the manuscripts, sciences, and aesthetic sensibilities that had crossed the Mediterranean in the wake of the Crusades. Likewise, in the Islamic world, the memory of that age deepened its own devotion to knowledge, architecture, and the preservation of wisdom. The cross and the crescent, once symbols of enmity, had become emblems of intertwined destiny. In the illuminated manuscripts of the West and the glazed tiles of the East, one can trace the same impulse, the desire to create something lasting out of the fleeting, to make beauty the final answer to destruction. And so, long after the warriors were gone, their ghosts lived on in the cathedrals and mosques, in the songs and poems, in the silent shimmer of stained glass and the flowing script of calligraphy. The Crusades, once an age of division, had left behind an inheritance of connection, a dialogue carried not in words, but in color, form, and sound. It is said that time transforms all conflict into memory, and all memory into art. In that sense, the true end of the Crusades was not a treaty or a fall of cities, but this quiet flowering, a shared testament to the strange, enduring beauty that can emerge from humanity's most turbulent dreams. Part 15, The Rise of the Ottomans and the Changing World. As the 14th century unfolded, the world that had once been shaped by the Crusades began to shift again. The old powers of the medieval age, Byzantium, the Ayyubids, the Crusader kingdoms, had faded into memory, leaving behind new contenders born from their ashes. The Mediterranean no longer thundered with the oars of Crusader fleets, nor did Jerusalem echo with the tramp of foreign armies. Yet the legacy of those centuries still lingered, like the hum of distant thunder on the horizon. Into this landscape of quiet transformation stepped a people who would reshape the balance of East and West for the next 600 years, the Ottomans. Their rise began humbly, almost imperceptibly. On the edge of the old Byzantine frontier, in the rugged hills of northwestern Anatolia, a small Turkish principality gathered strength under a chieftain named Osman, son of Ertugrul. He was not a conqueror in the image of Saladin or Richard, but a frontier leader, pragmatic, shrewd, and guided by faith. His followers, known as the Ghazis, saw themselves as warriors of the borderlands, protectors of Islam and seekers of fortune. They lived between worlds, where empires touched and cultures mingled, where battle and trade, prayer and politics, were part of the same rhythm of survival. By the time Osman's successors expanded across Anatolia, the world around them was crumbling. The Byzantine Empire, exhausted and fragmented after the Fourth Crusade, clung to life around Constantinople, a ghost of its former glory. The Mongol invasions had destabilized Persia and the Levant, scattering power and people alike. In this shifting world, the Ottomans' blend of adaptability and ambition became their strength. Unlike many who came before them, the Ottomans did not seek to destroy what they conquered, they sought to absorb it. Their rule spread not only through war, but through alliance, intermarriage, and the slow weaving of loyalty. Turkish, Greek, Arab, Armenian, and Balkan influences blended together under their banners. Their courts employed poets and scholars from across the Islamic world, their armies included Christians who converted or served willingly under their rule. The Ottoman vision of empire was not one of purity, but of synthesis. As the 14th century gave way to the 15th, this synthesis began to bear fruit. The Ottomans crossed into Europe, establishing a foothold in the Balkans. Cities like Edirne and Thessaloniki came under their control, and with each conquest, the empire grew not only in territory but in complexity. The Balkans, long a mosaic of kingdoms and cultures, became a meeting ground between Islam and Christendom. There were tensions, of course, but there was also exchange, the same quiet blending that had defined the centuries after the Crusades. By the time of Sultan Murad II and his son Mehmed II, the Ottoman state had matured into something unique. It was both warrior and administrator, spiritual and worldly, traditional and innovative. Its soldiers prayed before battle, its scribes recorded decrees in Arabic and Persian, and its architects dreamed of domes that could rival the heavens. The empire's ambition, once local, had become universal. It was under Mehmed II, known to history as Mehmed the Conqueror, that this ambition reached its fulfillment. In 1453, he set his sights on the city that had once been the heart of two worlds, Constantinople. For 1,000 years, the city had stood as the jewel of Byzantium, its massive walls defying every enemy that approached. Crusaders, Persians, Arabs, and Bulgarians had all failed to take it. But Mehmed was no ordinary adversary. He combined the discipline of the old Islamic dynasties with the science and strategy of the New Age. When his cannons roared outside Constantinople's walls, it was not merely a siege, it was a turning of history's page. After 53 days, the city that had once been the capital of the Roman world fell. On May 29, 1453, Mehmed rode through its gates and declared it the new seat of his empire. He named it Istanbul, meaning to the city, and in that act, he bridged the ancient and the modern. The fall of Constantinople marked the symbolic end of the medieval world. For Europe, it was a moment of shock and awe, the final echo of the Crusades' long struggle. For the Islamic world, it was a triumph tempered by reverence. Mehmed did not destroy the city he had conquered, he revived it. He ordered the repair of aqueducts, the reopening of markets, the preservation of churches. The Hagia Sophia, long the greatest church in Christendom, was converted into a mosque, not desecrated, but transformed, its beauty preserved beneath Arabic calligraphy and the rhythm of prayer. In its transformation lay a symbol of continuity, a structure that had stood through empire after empire, still sheltering human devotion beneath its vast dome. The rise of the Ottomans thus marked a new phase in the long dialogue between cross and crescent. Unlike the Crusades, which had been fueled by zeal and division, this new era was defined by structure and synthesis. Under Ottoman rule, Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived side by side under a system known as the millet, which allowed each community its own laws and leaders. It was not perfect, no empire ever is, but it reflected a pragmatic tolerance, a recognition that coexistence was stronger than exclusion. Trade once again flowed across the Mediterranean and the Silk Road. Scholars from Persia, Cairo, and Andalusia converged in Istanbul, turning it into a city of learning and art. The empire's scribes compiled encyclopedias of law and medicine. Its astronomers mapped the heavens with instruments refined from those inherited through centuries of exchange. The same sciences that had crossed the sea after the Crusades now found new patrons in the palaces of the Bosporus. To Europe, the Ottomans were at once a threat and a fascination. They represented both the memory of the Crusades and the mystery of the East, disciplined, devout, and dazzlingly sophisticated. Artists painted their sultans in exotic finery, diplomats wrote of their palaces and their justice. The old idea of the enemy began to blur. In some ways, the Ottomans were the culmination of everything the Crusades had set in motion, the final merging of two worlds that had spent centuries circling one another. As the 16th century dawned, the empire stretched from the deserts of Arabia to the gates of Vienna. Its armies carried banners embroidered with verses from the Quran, its architects raised minarets that pierced the sky, its scholars debated law and logic in echoing courtyards. Yet beneath the grandeur, the same currents that had shaped the Crusades still flowed, the tension between faith and reason, unity and division, power and humility. The world had changed, but the questions had not. The Crusades had once sought to define the boundary between East and West, the Ottomans erased it. They stood astride that old divide, turning it into a bridge. The legacy of that bridge would last long after their empire itself began to fade. In time, as the sun set over the domes and towers of Istanbul, the great city seemed to embody all that history had wrought, not a tale of conquest, but of continuity. Beneath the same sky that had witnessed the rise and fall of crusaders and emperors, the call to prayer mingled once more with the sound of church bells, faint and distant, yet familiar. And in that mingling, of voices, of faiths, of centuries, the story of the Crusades found its quiet resolution. Not in victory, nor in defeat, but in endurance. For the world that rose after the Crusades was no longer divided by walls, but bound by memory, the long, slow memory of 1,000 years of struggle, transformation, and rebirth. Part 16, The Long Shadow, the Crusades in Western Memory. Long after the banners of Jerusalem had been lowered, and the last knights had returned to their homelands, the idea of the Crusades refused to die. In the villages and cathedrals of Europe, in the pages of chronicles and the verses of poets, the memory of those distant campaigns remained, reshaped, reimagined, and endlessly retold. It became not merely history, but myth, a mirror through which Europe reflected upon itself. By the 15th century, the age of the Crusades was long over, yet its presence lingered in the collective consciousness like the faint glow of twilight on an old battlefield. Few alive could recall its true hardships or its contradictions, but everyone knew its symbols, the red cross on a white field, the image of armored pilgrims setting forth toward the east, the dream of sacred purpose carried across oceans and deserts. The reality had faded, but the legend endured, and legends, as they so often do, began to shape the future. In monasteries, monks copied the chronicles of the great expeditions, the marches across Anatolia, the siege of Jerusalem, the heroism and folly of kings. These texts were read not as records, but as moral lessons. To some, they were examples of faith unbroken, to others, of pride punished. The Crusades became, in a sense, Europe's own parable, a story that revealed both its spiritual longing and its human frailty. For the Church, the memory of the Crusades remained a powerful instrument. Though no pope after the 13th century could raise armies on the scale of Urban II's first call, the notion of crusade, of sacred struggle, continued to shape politics and preaching. In Spain, the Reconquista against the Moors was cast as the continuation of the same holy mission, culminating in the fall of Granada in 1492. The language of crusade had migrated from the Levant to Iberia, from Jerusalem to the hills of Andalusia. Faith and warfare had fused so deeply in Europe's imagination that to fight for one's belief was seen as both duty and redemption. Yet as Europe began to awaken to new horizons, the age of discovery, the Renaissance, the expansion of science and humanism, the image of the Crusades began to shift again. Scholars looked back upon that age with mixed emotions. The humanists of Florence and Venice, steeped in classical learning, saw in the Crusades a chapter of both courage and excess, a time when devotion had blinded reason, and zeal had cost more than it gained. Writers like Petrarch spoke of the East not as an enemy, but as a place of ancient wisdom. The memory of Saladin, once the other, began to take on the aura of nobility, even chivalry. In a strange reversal, Europe began to admire the virtues of the men it had once fought so fiercely. In art and literature, this transformation deepened. The Crusades became the setting for romance rather than history, the stage upon which ideals of love, honor, and adventure could unfold. Poets wove tales of noble knights and virtuous maidens, of trials endured and faith tested. The reality of hunger, dust, and disease disappeared, replaced by the shimmering myth of the noble Crusader. This myth would travel through centuries, resurfacing in Renaissance epics, Baroque paintings, and later in the pages of the Romantic poets. In the courts of France and England, heraldry still bore the signs of Crusader ancestry. Families traced their lineage to those who had taken the cross, whether truthfully or by invention. Crusading became part of Europe's identity, a distant symbol of piety and valor, invoked whenever the West sought to define itself in contrast to the world beyond. Yet for all its glory in song and story, the Crusades were also a memory of failure, of a dream that had promised unity and delivered division. The Protestant Reformation would cast that memory in yet another light. To reformers like Martin Luther, the Crusades were not triumphs of faith, but examples of its corruption. He saw in them the vanity of papal ambition and the futility of trying to win salvation by the sword. For the new age of reason and reform, the Crusades stood as a caution, a symbol of how spiritual fervor, untethered from wisdom, could become destructive. And yet, the fascination never faded. The Crusades continued to haunt Europe's imagination precisely because they embodied so many of its contradictions: piety and pride, courage and cruelty, hope and despair. They were, in essence, a mirror of the medieval soul. By the 17th and 18th centuries, historians began to approach them with curiosity rather than devotion. Enlightenment thinkers saw them as relics of a less rational time, while travelers and artists, swept up in the allure of the Orient, revived their imagery in new ways. Painters depicted the meeting of Richard and Saladin not as a clash of faiths, but as a meeting of equals, symbols of nobility transcending enmity. Philosophers and novelists used the Crusades as allegories for the human condition, the endless quest for meaning, the pilgrimage through darkness toward light. Even as Europe moved into the modern age, the Crusades retained a peculiar hold on its imagination. When explorers sailed to the Americas, when missionaries ventured to distant lands, they often borrowed the language of holy mission. The idea of spreading civilization and faith, sometimes noble, sometimes misguided, echoed the same impulses that had once driven men eastward to Jerusalem. The word crusade itself began to evolve, shedding its religious armor to become a metaphor for any passionate cause. In time, it would be used for campaigns of charity, reform, even science, a linguistic reminder that humanity never quite forgets its oldest dreams. And yet, beneath all the transformation, the shadow remained, the awareness that the Crusades had not been purely noble, that they had carried suffering in their wake. Modern Europe, as it grew more introspective, began to reckon with this. The same age that produced knights and cathedrals had also produced intolerance and bloodshed. To remember the Crusades honestly was to confront the paradox of one's own past, the ability to seek God and yet lose sight of humanity. In that paradox lies their enduring power. The Crusades were not just wars, they were mirrors of human longing, for purpose, for redemption, for transcendence. That is why they continue to fascinate, not as history alone, but as reflection. Today, when historians speak of the Crusades, they no longer tell a single story. They tell many, of faith and folly, of East and West, of loss and connection. They remind us that memory is never still, it changes with the teller, reshaping itself to fit the world that remembers it. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of all, that even the most turbulent chapters of history, once softened by time, become instruments of understanding. The Crusades, once cries for domination, became lessons in humility, reminders of how deeply the human spirit yearns to make meaning, even amid misunderstanding. As the candlelight flickered in monasteries, as printing presses began to hum in cities, and as new continents were charted on parchment maps, the memory of the Crusades drifted further from the realm of history into the realm of symbol. The long shadow they cast was not one of darkness, but of depth, the kind that reveals, even as it obscures. And beneath that shadow, Europe continued its long journey toward the light of modernity, carrying with it the distant echo of pilgrims' footsteps. Those who had once set out, in all their hope and confusion, seeking a city of heaven upon the earth. Part 17, The Crusades in the Islamic and Ottoman Imagination. By the time the Ottomans rose to dominance in the 15th century, the Crusades were no longer a living memory but a distant echo, stories of a bygone age, kept alive in chronicles, mosques, and the soft recitation of poets. The warriors who had once faced the cross-bearing armies of the West were long buried, their names preserved only in manuscripts and songs. Yet their deeds, and the lessons drawn from them, continued to shape the imagination of the Islamic world. For the Ottomans, heirs to both the Seljuks and the Caliphs, the Crusades represented more than history, they were part of the story of civilization itself. The empire that rose from the frontiers of Anatolia saw in those old conflicts a mirror of its own destiny, a reminder that the struggle between empires was less about faith than about endurance, wisdom, and order. In the early centuries of Ottoman rule, the Crusades were remembered as a time of trial overcome. The chroniclers of Istanbul, writing under the patronage of sultans, spoke of the Franks, the name used broadly for Europeans, as once fearsome adversaries, now subdued by time and fate. The victories of Saladin, the steadfastness of Damascus, and the resilience of Cairo were woven into the empire's self-image. The Ottomans saw themselves not as heirs to war, but as guardians of its resolution. The great cities that had witnessed the Crusades, Jerusalem, Aleppo, Damascus, now flourished under Ottoman protection. Pilgrims from across Islam traveled to the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, finding them tended, preserved, and filled with quiet dignity. For centuries, Ottoman administrators ensured that these holy places remained open not only to Muslims but also to Christians and Jews, echoing the ancient rhythms of coexistence that Saladin had once restored. In Ottoman chronicles, the memory of the Crusades was often framed within a broader understanding of divine history, a cycle of rise, fall, and renewal. The chroniclers saw empires as instruments in the unfolding of God's will, and the Crusades as a chapter in humanity's long test of faith. To them, the wars were not merely about territory or creed, but about the moral balance between humility and hubris. In this sense, the Ottomans remembered the Crusades not with bitterness, but with solemnity. Within the palaces of Istanbul, scholars and historians collected manuscripts from every corner of the empire. They studied Old Arabic and Persian chronicles of the Crusader era, copying them onto new pages, preserving them for future generations. In these texts, figures like Saladin and Nur ad-Din stood not as symbols of endless struggle, but as paragons of righteous rule, men who had defended faith with restraint and governed with justice. Their example became a measure for leadership itself. The poets of the Ottoman age often returned to these figures, not to recount battles, but to meditate on the fleeting nature of power. In their verses, the crusading age became a metaphor, the struggle between light and shadow, between divine purpose and human ambition. Some poets likened Saladin to the prophets of old, his sword an instrument of clarity in a world clouded by confusion. Others used his story to remind rulers of humility, warning that even the greatest conquerors would one day be judged not by their victories, but by their mercy. The memory of the Crusades also shaped the empire's view of Europe. In diplomatic exchanges with Western powers, Ottoman statesmen often evoked the language of history, reminding their counterparts that peace between civilizations was possible, that the time of holy wars had given way to the age of trade, scholarship, and shared curiosity. This was not mere rhetoric, it reflected a genuine confidence. The Ottomans saw themselves as the inheritors of a world once divided, now unified under a single, pragmatic order. In the 16th and 17th centuries, as European explorers charted new seas and empires rose in the Americas, the Ottomans remained anchored in their older understanding of time. To them, the Crusades belonged to a world that had been conquered not by the sword, but by wisdom. Their scholars studied astronomy, philosophy, and medicine with the same devotion that their ancestors had brought to faith. The struggle had moved from battlefield to mind, from outward conquest to inward reflection. Even so, the Crusades lingered in popular memory. In the coffee houses of Damascus and Cairo, storytellers would recite tales of old, of kings and knights, of Saladin and Richard, of fortresses and miracles. These stories were not told in anger, but with the gentle nostalgia that time bestows upon all great conflicts. The listeners, sipping their coffee under the glow of lanterns, heard in them both pride and melancholy, pride in endurance, and melancholy for an age when the world seemed smaller, its meaning clearer. As the centuries passed, and the Ottoman Empire began its slow retreat from Europe, the old word crusade reappeared in new contexts. Western powers, rekindling memories for their own purposes, sometimes invoked it in their wars and explorations. The Ottomans watched these invocations with weary understanding. They had learned that history moved in cycles, and that words, once spoken in zeal, often outlived the wisdom of their time. Yet even as Europe rediscovered its crusading language, the Ottoman memory of those events remained grounded in moderation. The sultans saw themselves as the keepers of balance between faiths, heirs not to the chaos of the past but to its resolution. Their reign over Jerusalem stood as quiet testimony. Beneath the crescents and crosses that crowned the city's skyline, life went on in a harmony born of endurance rather than idealism. In the late centuries of the empire, when Ottoman historians looked back upon the age of the Crusades, they saw it as the adolescence of civilizations, a time of passion and misunderstanding that had, through suffering, matured into coexistence. They wrote not of vengeance, but of reflection. From every war, one scholar wrote, comes a wound in the earth, and from every wound, a flower of wisdom. That flower bloomed in the Ottoman age, in the architecture that blended Byzantine and Islamic forms, in the laws that balanced tradition with pragmatism, in the music that carried echoes of East and West alike. It was as if the memory of the Crusades had been absorbed into the empire's very soul, not as trauma, but as tempering, a fire that had once burned too brightly, now transformed into light. And so, as the evening call to prayer drifted over the Bosporus, mingling with the faint toll of a church bell, the long memory of the Crusades rested at last, not forgotten, but reconciled. The Ottomans, standing upon the bridge between continents and centuries, carried forward both its burden and its beauty, proving that even the most turbulent histories can, with time, give rise to peace. In that quiet coexistence, in that patient wisdom, the story of the Crusades found its gentlest ending, a lesson written not in conquest, but in continuity, whispered across generations in the cadence of faith and the stillness of understanding. Part 18, The Rediscovery of the Holy Land, Pilgrims and Scholars in the Modern Age. As the world drifted from the medieval into the modern, the Holy Land, once the heart of conquest and devotion, began to transform again, not through battle or crusade, but through rediscovery. The ancient roads that had once echoed with the tramp of Crusader boots now lay silent under the desert sun. The fortresses that had guarded the pilgrim routes crumbled into the sand. And yet, even in their ruins, they called to the imagination of another age, one driven not by swords or salvation, but by wonder. By the 17th century, the memory of the Crusades had softened into legend. The maps of Europe were redrawn, the Ottoman Empire held firm over Jerusalem and the Levant, and the era of exploration had shifted the gaze of Christendom westward to the Americas and eastward to the Indies. But somewhere beneath the surface of Europe's curiosity, in the hearts of monks, scholars, and dreamers, the pull of the Holy Land endured. Pilgrims still came, though fewer than before. They arrived not as soldiers, but as seekers, humble, reflective, often weary travelers who crossed the sea from Venice or Marseille, carrying not armor but prayer books. They came to touch the stones of Jerusalem, to walk the path of the Via Dolorosa, to kneel at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Their journeys were quieter now, stripped of grandeur, but perhaps more honest. Where once kings had led armies, now simple men and women came in silence, seeking not redemption for Christendom, but peace for themselves. These pilgrimages, once a matter of collective purpose, had become profoundly personal. The age of faith had given way to the age of introspection. In the quiet chapels of Bethlehem and Nazareth, one could almost hear the echo of time, the centuries of devotion layered upon one another like dust upon old stone. For many of these travelers, the Holy Land was no longer a battlefield or a symbol of divine rivalry, but a place of convergence, where the faiths of the world coexisted uneasily yet peacefully beneath the same sun. By the 18th century, another kind of pilgrim began to arrive, one driven by curiosity rather than creed. Scholars, antiquarians, and cartographers from Europe began to map the lands that had once seemed mythical. They traced the courses of ancient rivers, measured the foundations of ruined castles, and sought to identify the exact sites mentioned in Scripture. Some came in the service of faith, others in the service of reason, but all came under the same spell, the peculiar enchantment of a land that seemed to belong to both history and eternity. For these early explorers, the Holy Land was a vast palimpsest, a manuscript written and rewritten by countless civilizations. Beneath the stones of Jerusalem, they found the bones of older cities, Jebusite walls, Roman pavements, Byzantine mosaics. Each layer told a story not of victory or defeat, but of endurance. The scholars wrote of how faith had left traces in every grain of dust, how the land itself seemed to remember, long after empires had forgotten. In their writings, a new kind of reverence emerged, one grounded not in conquest, but in contemplation. The explorers of the Enlightenment, who had often been skeptical of religion's power, found in the Holy Land something they could not explain away. They wrote of the strange stillness of the Jordan Valley, of the haunting beauty of the Dead Sea, of the olive groves that shimmered in the light like silver. Here, wrote one traveler, the soul of the world seems older, slower, and infinitely patient. Their accounts rekindled Europe's fascination. Painters began to depict biblical scenes with renewed realism, using the sketches and notes of travelers as their guide. The East, once imagined through the lens of the Crusades, became a landscape of light and mystery. The romantic imagination of the 19th century turned its gaze eastward again, but this time, it was not the gaze of conquest. It was the gaze of nostalgia. Writers like Chateaubriand, Lamartine, and later, Mark Twain, described their journeys to the Holy Land with a blend of awe and melancholy. They wrote of the ruins of Crusader castles swallowed by weeds, of minarets rising over ancient churches, of pilgrims of every faith crossing paths at dusk. The Holy Land had become a mirror of the human condition, scarred yet sacred, divided yet enduring. For the Ottoman rulers who governed these regions, the influx of Western travelers was both curiosity and concern. They recognized the fascination the Holy Land held for the Christian world, and they took care to maintain its accessibility, regulating pilgrimages, protecting sacred sites, and quietly profiting from the flow of visitors. Ottoman archives from the 18th and 19th centuries reveal meticulous lists of travelers, permissions granted, and routes secured, evidence that the age of pilgrimage had not ended, but evolved. Meanwhile, archaeology began to emerge as a new kind of devotion, a science of faith and memory intertwined. Excavations at Jericho, Megiddo, and Jerusalem sought to uncover the world beneath the scriptures. Every shard of pottery, every inscription, became a bridge across time. What the Crusades had tried to claim by force, these new explorers sought to understand through patience. It was, in a way, another kind of crusade, not for dominion, but for knowledge. Yet, even as scholars measured and catalogued, the Holy Land retained its mystery. The people who lived there, Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, Jews, continued their daily lives as they always had, largely indifferent to the fascination of distant nations. To them, the land was not a symbol, but a home. In the fields outside Bethlehem, shepherds still tended their flocks as they had in the time of David. In Jerusalem's narrow alleys, traders called out in a dozen languages, their voices echoing through stone corridors that had heard the same cadence for 1,000 years. The 19th century brought yet another transformation. As European powers expanded their empires, the Holy Land once again became a stage for ambition. Consulates and missions sprouted in Jerusalem, churches were rebuilt or claimed, archaeological societies were formed in London, Paris, and Berlin. The memory of the Crusades returned in subtler form, not as armies, but as institutions. The same impulse that had once sent knights across the sea now sent scholars, diplomats, and missionaries, armed not with swords, but with pens, books, and surveys. Still, beneath the politics and scholarship, the deeper current remained unchanged, humanity's longing to touch the past, to walk where the sacred and the temporal meet. Travelers wrote of standing on the Mount of Olives at dawn, watching the first light strike the domes and towers of Jerusalem. They described the hush that fell upon them, the sense that, despite centuries of conflict and change, something eternal lingered in the air. The rediscovery of the Holy Land, then, was not merely geographical, it was spiritual. The land had not changed, humanity had. The pilgrims of the modern age came not to conquer or convert, but to remember. The old divisions between East and West, though still present, softened in the shared reverence for history. The stones of Jerusalem belonged to all who walked among them, believers and skeptics alike. In that sense, the modern rediscovery of the Holy Land was the final transformation of the Crusades' legacy. What had begun in blood and zeal ended in contemplation. The very places once fought over now invited reflection. The swords that had once been raised in God's name had long rusted away, replaced by notebooks, sketches, and prayers whispered softly in many tongues. And as evening settled over the hills of Judea, the old city glowed in the fading light, domes, minarets, and spires side by side, their shadows stretching across the same earth that had borne centuries of hope and sorrow. To the modern traveler, it was no longer a symbol of triumph or loss, but of endurance. A living reminder that even the most turbulent history can yield peace, if only time is patient enough to teach it. Part 19, The Crusades and the Birth of the Modern World. When people speak of the birth of the modern world, they often think of the Renaissance, the age of exploration, the Enlightenment, moments when Europe awoke to curiosity, discovery, and reason. But beneath those familiar landmarks lies a quieter truth. The seeds of that transformation were planted long before, in the age of the Crusades. Though born in faith and conflict, the Crusades were also bridges, between worlds, between ideas, between the medieval and the modern. Their legacy was not just blood and ruin, but motion. They set the world turning, and it has not stopped since. In the 11th century, when Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade, Europe was still inward-looking, a patchwork of feudal kingdoms, rural villages, and cloistered monasteries. Travel was perilous, trade limited, knowledge fragmented. Few in the West had seen beyond their own valleys, let alone imagined the cosmopolitan cities of the East. But when tens of thousands of men and women set out toward Jerusalem, carrying not only their faith but their fears, something shifted. Roads were opened that had been silent for centuries. Ships sailed across seas long forgotten by commerce. Cultures that had lived in parallel for ages suddenly collided, and through that collision came exchange. It began with trade. The Crusades, for all their religious ambition, required ships, provisions, and money. Italian cities like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa became the arteries of this new world, transporting crusaders and goods across the Mediterranean. From the east came spices, silk, glass, sugar, and paper, luxuries once unknown in Europe. In return went wool, metal, and the beginnings of a commercial spirit that would outlast the wars themselves. These trade routes became lifelines, binding East and West together in a network that would eventually circle the globe. The merchants who managed this flow of goods began to think differently about wealth and risk. They developed new systems of credit, partnership, and insurance, the earliest forms of capitalism. The Crusades, by accident rather than intent, had transformed the way Europe thought about money. Faith had set the ships in motion, but profit kept them sailing. Knowledge, too, crossed those same waters. Crusaders, pilgrims, and scholars encountered civilizations more advanced in science, medicine, and mathematics than their own. In the libraries of Damascus and Baghdad, ancient Greek and Roman texts had been preserved, translated, and studied for centuries. Arab scholars had refined algebra, charted the stars, and written treatises on philosophy that bridged reason and faith. When these works reached Europe, carried home by monks and merchants, copied and translated in Sicily, Spain, and Italy, they ignited an intellectual fire. The rediscovery of Aristotle, the medical writings of Avicenna, the astronomy of Al-Biruni, all entered Europe through the same gates the Crusaders had once battered down. Universities began to rise in their wake, first in Bologna and Paris, then in Oxford and Salamanca. The idea that knowledge could be pursued, debated, and built upon became the quiet echo of the age that had once known only prayer and obedience. The Crusades had torn open the boundaries of the medieval mind, and through those openings came light. Architecture, too, bore the mark of this encounter. The pointed arch, the ribbed vault, the rose window, the hallmarks of Gothic design, all drew inspiration from Islamic and Byzantine forms. When builders of the 13th century lifted cathedrals toward the heavens, they were, unknowingly, paying tribute to the domes and minarets they had seen in the East. Even the concept of the city, as a place of exchange, learning, and culture, owed something to the bustling metropolises of the Muslim world. But perhaps the most profound inheritance of the Crusades was psychological. Europe, through the Crusades, discovered the vastness of the world, and its own smallness within it. The myth of a single, self-contained Christendom was forever broken. To march across deserts, to see cities older and grander than any in the West, to meet scholars who spoke in equations and philosophies rather than dogma, these experiences humbled as much as they inspired. For every knight who returned home with relics, there was another who returned with questions. Those questions multiplied. If other civilizations could thrive, could reason coexist with faith? Could trade flourish without conquest? Could beauty take forms outside one's own? Slowly, across generations, those questions became the undercurrent of Europe's awakening. The very curiosity that drove Columbus westward, that led Copernicus to study the heavens, that inspired Leonardo to paint and dissect and imagine, all drew, in some small way, from the widening of perspective that began when the first Crusaders looked beyond the horizon. The Church, too, changed. Though the Crusades had been its grandest expression of authority, they had also exposed its limits. The papacy learned that faith could not command the world indefinitely, that kings would pursue their own ambitions, and that salvation was not something that could be decreed by arms. The slow secularization of Europe, the idea that power could exist apart from religion, found its earliest roots in the failures of those holy wars. The Crusades also reshaped Europe's identity. The encounter with the East forced a reckoning with what it meant to be Christian, European, or even civilized. These concepts, once simple, became complex, layered with comparison and contradiction. In time, that tension would fuel the humanism of the Renaissance, a movement that sought to reconcile divine purpose with human experience. In the centuries that followed, the spirit of the Crusades would echo in strange ways. When explorers sailed under royal banners to the Americas and Asia, they carried with them the old language of mission and discovery. When empires justified conquest in the name of civilization, they unknowingly echoed the sermons of Urban II. And when reformers, scientists, and revolutionaries challenged old hierarchies, they too drew from the same impulse that had driven Crusaders to leave home, the yearning to find meaning beyond the known. The Crusades, in their paradoxical way, had made the world more connected. They had begun as an attempt to restore a single holy city, and ended by creating a web of movement, exchange, and transformation that spanned continents. They revealed both the heights of human aspiration and the depths of human folly, how easily ideals could turn to violence, and how even violence could give birth to progress. By the dawn of the modern age, their direct memory had faded. But their consequences, the trade routes, the philosophies, the mingling of East and West, had become permanent. The Mediterranean, once a battlefield, had become a bridge again. The same seas that carried knights now carried merchants, poets, and ideas. In that way, the Crusades stand as one of history's great ironies. What began as an attempt to claim the world for heaven helped give rise to the world we live in, restless, interconnected, endlessly searching. If one listens carefully, across the centuries, the Crusades do not sound like the clash of swords anymore. They sound like the turning of pages, the rolling of waves, the murmur of scholars in candlelit rooms, tracing the same questions that have haunted humanity since the beginning. How do we reconcile faith and reason? How do we live among difference? And how do we build a world from the ruins of our own convictions? In the long view of time, perhaps this was the Crusades' most enduring gift. Not their victories or their monuments, but their awakening. They made the world larger. They forced humanity to see itself reflected in the eyes of the stranger. And though that reflection was painful, it was also necessary. From the ashes of faith's greatest contradiction rose the dawn of reason's greatest age. And in that transformation, from zeal to curiosity, from conflict to connection, the modern world took its first breath. Part 20, The Echo of the Crusades, Lessons for Humanity. As the centuries turned and the world reshaped itself, the Crusades faded into history, their banners tattered, their castles crumbling into the soil. Yet, though their age passed, their echo remained. It lingered not in the clash of arms, but in the deep memory of humanity, in the way cultures remember one another, in the way nations define themselves, and in the way faith continues to seek meaning in a fractured world. History rarely offers pure victories. What it offers instead are mirrors, reflections of what we hope to be and what we are. The Crusades, for all their contradictions, became such a mirror. In them, we see devotion and delusion intertwined, courage and cruelty walking hand in hand. We see how belief, when kindled without understanding, can light both the path to salvation and the fire of destruction. But we also see resilience, the ability of people to rebuild, to learn, and to continue searching for common ground even after centuries of misunderstanding. When the Crusades began, they were born of a medieval certainty, the belief that truth belonged to one faith, one people, one destiny. But by the time their long shadow receded, the world had grown more complex. The East and West, through conflict and exchange, had learned of one another's depths. They had shared not only war, but art, architecture, philosophy, and trade. The faiths that had once clashed now recognized, however reluctantly, that they were bound together by geography, by memory, and by the same questions about the divine and the human. In the centuries after, the descendants of those once at war would trade ideas instead of arrows. They would borrow each other's words, sciences, and symbols. The scholars of Renaissance Europe would study texts preserved by Arab philosophers. The architects of Istanbul would build upon foundations laid by Byzantine engineers. The world that had once seemed divided into absolutes began to reveal its interdependence. That is the great paradox of history, that from conflict often comes connection, and from misunderstanding, curiosity. The Crusades had shown the danger of certainty, the peril of believing one holds the whole truth while others walk in darkness. The lessons of that age, though written in blood, would slowly give rise to tolerance, diplomacy, and dialogue. Not easily, not perfectly, but inevitably. If one stands today in Jerusalem at dusk, when the sun sinks low over the hills and the stones turn to gold, it is easy to feel the layers of that history pressing softly against the present. The muezzins call drifts through the air, mingling with the faint ringing of church bells. Pilgrims walk the same narrow alleys once trodden by soldiers and saints alike. Above them, the sky holds no sides, only light. It is there, in that mingling of sounds and silences, that the echo of the Crusades is perhaps most clearly heard, not as a cry of war, but as a hum of endurance, a reminder that time can heal even what faith once divided. The Crusades remind us that humanity's greatest struggles are not between East and West, or between faiths and nations, but within ourselves, between the will to dominate and the will to understand. They teach that truth cannot be conquered, only shared, that holiness cannot be possessed, only perceived. And that peace, the most elusive of victories, is never won by force, but by patience. In every generation, new forms of crusade arise, some noble, some misguided. The lesson of the old Crusades is to look carefully at the causes we call holy, to ask whether they build bridges or burn them. For history's greatest tragedy is not that we forget our wars, but that we repeat them in new forms, believing them to be different. Yet, there is hope in remembering. The Crusades, in all their chaos and consequence, remind us that humanity is capable of transformation. What began in fanaticism ended, centuries later, in curiosity, in learning, in dialogue. The same impulse that once sought to conquer Jerusalem would, in time, seek to understand the universe. The same courage that drove knights into battle would, in another age, drive explorers across oceans and scientists into discovery. History redeems even its darkest chapters, if we are willing to learn from them. And so, the story of the Crusades is not just a tale of empires and faiths, but of the human condition itself, of our longing for purpose, our hunger for the divine, our capacity for both cruelty and compassion. It is the story of how easily light becomes shadow, and how, even from that shadow, light can be born again. When one listens to history with a quiet heart, its lessons do not shout, they whisper. The Crusades whisper to us still, be wary of certainty, but never weary of seeking truth. Build, not upon fear, but upon understanding. For every wall that rises between peoples, time will always seek a way to wear it down. And perhaps that is the truest echo of all, that no matter how divided the world may seem, the long arc of memory bends, slowly but faithfully, toward connection. The roads that once led armies to Jerusalem now lead pilgrims, scholars, and dreamers. The seas that once carried ships of war now carry trade, ideas, and travelers in search of beauty. The world has moved on, but the echo remains, not as warning alone, but as wisdom. That faith and reason must walk together. That humility is stronger than conquest. And that every generation must find its own peace, not in the shadow of the past, but in the light of understanding. So ends the long story of the Crusades, not with triumph, nor defeat, but with reflection. The cities they built have fallen. The banners they raised have faded. But the questions they asked, about God, humanity, and the meaning of right and wrong, still linger, still resonate, still teach. And if one listens closely, as the world grows still, one might almost hear the faintest echo carried by the wind across centuries, not the sound of battle, but of prayer, soft and unending, reminding us that history, for all its turbulence, is but the world's long attempt to find peace within itself. With that, our episode comes to a close tonight. Thank you for tuning in tonight. Please subscribe, and comment on what you'd like to see in the next episode. Background Historian out.